Chapter 226, Keeping Her Behind, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. When old Duchess Xing saw that her husband had finally woken up, the tears that she had been holding back dripped down from her eyes. She cried out mournfully, "My Duke, you've finally recovered your appetite." Without waiting for the servants to move, she rushed over to the old Duke's side and personally helped him up to lean against the headboard. Chu Lian was clever enough to recover quickly from her instant of surprise. She moved the small table before old Duke Xing. Old Duke Xing had been bedridden for quite a period of time. The struggle just now seemed to have used up all his remaining strength. He couldn't even lift his hand up at this time, so he could only stare right at that plate of stuffed orange with crab meat with his eyes. Old Duchess Xing quickly took up one of the oranges and fed him personally. Once the soup entered his mouth, old Duke Xing's eyes shone even brighter. His heart was moved, his eyes were lit up, his nose was flared and his mouth was in the midst of enjoying bliss. After swallowing a mouthful of heaven, old Duke Xing had completely tossed his idea of fasting to the back of his head. If not for old Duchess Xing holding him back and not letting him eat too much at once, he would probably have gulped down an entire stuffed orange in 2 or 3 bites. Since old Duke Xing had woken up and had already broken his fast, it wasn't appropriate if strangers continued staying in the inner room. Leaving old Duchess Xing inside, the younger Duchess Xing invited the guests, including the imperial physician, to the outer room. After Duchess Xing invited Matriarch He to take a seat, she curtsied to Chu Lian in gratitude. This was all thanks to honored Lady Jeannie's efforts today. "Please, accept this bow from me." Chu Lian quickly helped the younger Duchess Xing up. "Madam, please don't stand on ceremony with me. It was just a small matter." Duchess Xing shook her head. "Honored Lady Jeannie, you don't have to be so humble. Even the imperial cooks couldn't have made such an amazing dish. Honored Lady really has some marvelous ideas. It's awe-inspiring to me." The back of Chu Lian's ears felt a little hot. How were these marvelous ideas? She was merely a gourmet who had collected knowledge from the centuries of cooks before her. Duchess Xing had really evaluated her too highly. When Matriarch He saw that her granddaughter-in-law was seemingly embarrassed, she chuckled. "Samlang's wife, have you made more of those stuffed oranges? If there's more, bring some up for us to taste as well. My appetite has been awoken by your descriptions just now." Chu Lian nodded, "I have." After saying so, she retrieved a larger box of food from Mingyan's hands. The servants had sent over quite a number of oranges to the kitchen just now, and it didn't take much to prepare them. Thus, Chu Lian had made a few more portions, thinking to let everyone have a taste of something new. It was just the right time to bring out the extra portions now. Each person had 1 orange, even the imperial physician who had come to check on old Duke Xing had one. The people present here weren't as picky as old Duke Xing. Thus, the impact of the gourmet food was even more stronger on them. The imperial physician held on to the empty orange, feeling unsatisfied. He stared at the empty shell in his hands, finally having a shred of sympathy for old Duke Xing's predicament. After tasting something so carefully prepared and so delicious, having to return to normal fare was like going from heaven to hell. It was extremely painful. Old Duke Xing had just woken up, so no matter how tasty the food was, old Duchess Xing didn't dare to give him much of it. She could only try her best to persuade him and finally managed to convince the old Duke. After finishing his meal, old Duke Xing had used up all the energy he had. He closed his eyes and returned to bed. The imperial physician took this chance to enter the inner room again and check the old Duke's pulse. When he came out, old Duchess Xing anxiously asked about the old Duke's health. The physician smiled and reported that the Duke would be fine. Actually, old Duke Xing had a healthy body and sharp mind despite his age, he was just a little more picky about his food. This time, he had become bedridden due to fasting. So now that he was willingly to eat again, and since Chu Lian had prepared a nourishing meal, his body would recover just fine after some time. In the days ahead, he just had to drink some nourishing decoctions and eat normally. Chapter 227, Keeping Her Behind, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The ladies of the Jing estate were overjoyed. Matriarchy was also happy for her old sister upon hearing the news. Since old Duke Sheng was fine now, it wouldn't be appropriate for them to continue disturbing his rest. Thus, Matriarchy wanted to bid her goodbyes for today. Old Duchess Sheng had just agreed to send them off when her daughter-in-law, the younger Duchess Sheng, tugged at her sleeve and shot a look at her. She then whispered a little into old Duchess Sheng's ear. The old woman stiffened for a bit. Her expression turned a little troubled and she turned to Matriarchy with some embarrassment. She then looked again at the bright-eyed Chu Lian standing behind Matriarchy. Old sister, I have a request. The slight smile on Matriarchy's face disappeared and she stated sternly, although we're not sisters by blood, our friendship is no less closer than any real sisters. What is there that you can't speak of in front of me? After hearing such a generous reassurance from Matriarchy, old Duchess Xing finally set down her pride to plead, could you let honored Lady Jeannie stay in the Jing estate for a few more days? Old sister, you know that my duke has such a picky appetite. I'm afraid that he won't want to eat anything again after waking up. Old Duchess Xing knew that her request was a little too much. Chu Lian wasn't married to House Xing and she didn't have any close connections with House Xing either. Furthermore, she was already married to someone else. It would be very improper for her to stay at the Jing estate. Also, this request did make it seem like the old duchess was treating Chu Lian like a mere cook. Even if Chu Lian didn't hold a ranked noble title like she did now, this was a rather degrading request. If this matter didn't concern old Duke Sheng's health, Matriarchy would have thrown a temper at her old sister. When she heard this request, Chu Lian's brows furrowed together. She really wanted to reject it outright, but this was old Duchess Xing and Matriarchy's conversation. It wasn't her place to speak here, let alone interrupt. Thus, Chu Lian's expectant eyes turned to Matriarchy's face. If the matriarch handed her out without any hesitation at this moment, then Chu Lian would be utterly disappointed at the He family. Any trace of a smile had been completely wiped from Matriarchy's face. A stern expression took its place instead. She looked at her old sister and shook her head after a moment of thought. She firmly said, I know you're anxious, but this request is too unreasonable. Sanlang's wife is still young. I won't be able to rest easy if she's staying out of the Jing'an estate. On top of that, Chu Lian could only help with the pressing matter at hand, but she couldn't take care of old Duke Xing forever. She wasn't a servant. She was House Jing'an's third young madam, Sanlang's lawfully wedded wife. Chu Lian hadn't expected Matriarchy to have refused the request so resolutely. On one hand, she hadn't been disappointed. On the other, she felt warm inside. Her fondness for the He family grew a little more. Due to this fondness, her eyes had lit up brightly with the warmth of her feelings. Old Duchess Xing also hadn't expected such a curt refusal from her old sister. She didn't know how to round up the current situation. She opened her mouth, but was at a loss for what to say. Old Duchess Xing also knew that her request had been too overboard, but she was still unhappy that she had been refused so directly. The younger Duchess Xing didn't know what to say either, so the air around them turned awkward. Chu Lian noticed that the situation was taking a turn for the worse, so after a quick turn of wits, she spoke up, Grandmother, old Duchess Xing is just worried for the old Duke. Old Duke Xing is simply craving for good food. As long as he has something new to eat, he should be fine. Actually, this can be solved even without granddaughter-in-law around. When she finished speaking, everyone looked at her with surprise. She really had a solution to this problem. As long as matriarchy supported her, she would give her best to help them out. If it was just having to make new delicacies for old Duke Xing, then Chu Lian had plenty of ideas that could work even without her there. TL note, this is the last of the chapters one had translated before I left for my holiday. If you don't see the next chapter tomorrow, that means I wasn't able to translate on the plane or while traveling. Please hang in there until March 9th, I'll be back by then, love. Chapter 228, Attached, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Anyway, in the worst-case scenario, she could just pass down some secret recipes to the best cooks in the Jing estate. After all, she had enough of those so-called secret recipes to hand them out by the dozens. Chu Lian smiled. Old Duchess Xing, please wait for a moment. I would like to discuss this matter with my grandmother first. You won't be disappointed by the results. Old Duchess Xing and the younger Duchess Xing exchanged looks. They had indeed gone overboard with their request, so they felt a little guilty. Since Chu Lian was still trying to compromise despite their rude request, they quickly agreed. Old Duchess Xing even ordered her handmaid to lead them to a nearby room for privacy. Once they entered the room and closed the door, matriarchy took Chu Lian's hands into her own. Her tone was still rather miffed as she said, Lianer, they are the ones in the wrong for this matter. You don't have to try to accommodate them. Chu Lian helped matriarchy to a chair made of yellow peach wood and reassured, Grandmother, I know you're trying to protect me because you're worried I'll be taken advantage of. However, you and old Duchess Xing are such old friends, and old Duchess Xing was just worried for old Duke Zheng's health. I think her actions are forgivable. Furthermore, this matter isn't as serious as you think. Granddaughter-in-law has plenty of ways to let old Duke Xing eat all the delicacies he wants. Just sit here for a moment and don't worry for granddaughter-in-law. Granddaughter-in-law will take care of everything. Matriarchy stared into Chu Lian's bright eyes. When Chu Lian simply continued to innocently blink at her without a hint of forced reluctance, matriarchy set aside her worries and smiled. She was indeed close to old Duchess Xing and didn't want to make a huge fuss over this. Because the two of them were the matriarchs of their respective houses, it was hard to avoid these sorts of conflicts of interest. No matter how hard they tried, they just had different statuses and different interests at heart. They usually tried to avoid clashing with one another, but if they couldn't come to an agreement, then neither of them would give way. Today, if their roles had been reversed, old Duchess Xing would have done the same. However, if there was a solution that fulfilled the interests of both their sides, that would be even better. All right, grandmother will listen to you. Matriarchy patted Chu Lian's soft little hand. Chu Lian sat right next to matriarchy. The only people in this room were the trusted servants she had brought from the Jing'an estate, and there weren't any strangers here, so there was no need to observe etiquette so strictly. Chu Lian looked straight at the maidservant she had brought with her today, Xian and Mingyan. Both of them stiffened a little after receiving her gaze. They instantly understood what Chu Lian was thinking about. Actually, after listening to Chu Lian's conversation with matriarchy, they had already started to have an inkling of what Chu Lian's solution was. Xian's inner conflict was completely exposed from her expression and her brows started to furrow together. On the other hand, Mingyan didn't seem to show much emotion. Chu Lian quietly observed their reactions and motioned them closer. Xian, Mingyan, come over here. Xian and Mingyan walked up to Chu Lian with their heads lowered before asking in unison, Third young madam, do you have any orders for us? Chu Lian didn't like to beat around the bush, so she immediately said it straight out. I'm sure you've already guessed what I'm thinking of. Old Duke Xing needs someone to take care of him while he's recovering, but I can't stay behind in the Jing estate. You've been serving me all this time and I've never kept my cooking or secret recipes hidden from both of you. You must have learned quite a bit from the daily meals in my courtyard. Now that this chance has come, are either of you willing to stay behind and take care of old Duke Zheng's meals? As expected, Xian and Mingyan had indeed guessed what their young madam had in mind. By the time Chu Lian had finished telling them her proposal, Xian already appeared anxious and unwilling. Conversely, Mingyan was much calmer than Xian. She kept her head lowered with her fringe shielding her eyes. Chu Lian couldn't tell what she was thinking. Out of the corner of her eye, Mingyan cast a glance in Xian's direction and saw Xian's silent state. Since Xian was refraining from expressing her emotions aloud, Mingyan also didn't speak up. Chu Lian frowned when her two maidservants refused to speak. She continued explaining, "The two of you are my first-class personal handmaids, so I can't bear to send you off to someone else just like that. If one of you is willing to stay behind, when old Duke Shen gets better, I'll still send someone to bring you home. Of course, if both of you are not willing to stay back, I won't force it. There are always plenty of other solutions we can think of." Chu Lian didn't like to force others at all. If none of the handmaids wanted to stay back, she wouldn't force the issue. She could just give out a few more secret recipes to settle the matter. However, staying behind to take care of old Duke Zheng was a rare opportunity for Xian and Mingyan. The two of them weren't stupid. They most likely realized that there were many benefits for them in this arrangement. Chapter 229, Attached, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Matriarch He hadn't expected such a solution from Chu Lian. Her smile was full of hidden meaning as she also looked at Xian and Mingyan. After hearing Chu Lian's additional explanation, Xian had obviously relaxed, but Mingyan suddenly tensed. Chu Lian continued staring at the two handmaids. There was no small amount of pressure on them, facing down those piercing eyes. Xian and Mingyan's hearts were beating like drums. "Tell me honestly what you think about this. No matter what your choice is, I won't blame you." In an instant, Xian took in a deep breath and found the courage to look up. In a trembling voice, she said, "Third young madam, this servant doesn't want to stay behind. This servant only wants to serve by your side." Chu Lian was only startled for a moment. She smiled. "Then just stay by my side." "Mingyan, what about you?" Chu Lian's answer lifted the great burden in Xian's heart. She looked at her master with slightly misty eyes before moving to one side. When Mingyan heard Xian's response, she clearly became even more nervous. After a fierce battle with herself, Mingyan still chose the path that was the most beneficial to herself. She looked up into Chu Lian's eyes and said, "Third young madam, this servant is willing to stay behind to look after old Duke Zheng." Mingyan had a pair of large eyes with double eyelids. Compared to Fuyan's liveliness, she was much more taciturn. The original novel hadn't described Mingyan much. Chu Lian also hadn't noticed any shortcomings in her personality after observing her for a few days. However, as she was someone serving her so closely, Chu Lian would always find a way to test her personality. Today's problem was one such chance. Unfortunately, Mingyan had clearly disappointed her. However, this was her own choice, so Chu Lian wasn't going to blame her. Chu Lian's expression didn't reveal any trace of her inner thoughts. She smiled sweetly and said, "All right, then you'll stay and take care of old Duke Zheng. Since you're my handmaid, don't disgrace my name. Don't be stingy with the secret recipes you've learned from me and use them generously for old Duke Zheng's meals. As for the rest of the arrangements, leave it to me and grandmother." Mingyan hadn't expected Chu Lian to have agreed so quickly. Her sudden happiness showed on her face. She secretly glanced at Chu Lian before looking carefully at Matriarch He. It was only after observing their expressions that Mingyan finally relaxed. She began to look forward to her new life in the Jing estate. In the end, as smart as Ming Yan was, she was only a young maidservant who hadn't seen much of the world. As ambitious as she might be, there was a limit to her vision. Since they had already finished their discussion and there wasn't any need for the other ideas she had prepared, Chu Lian instructed Ming Yan on a few other things before helping matriarchy out of the room. Old Duchess Sheng hadn't thought that a simple handmaid serving Chu Lian could know so many secret recipes. She was full of shock and surprise, as well as disbelief. A single secret recipe was already rare enough. Even if Chu Lian could cook well, she couldn't possibly be so generous as to teach all of her recipes to her handmaids. Taking in their disbelief, Chu Lian smiled and asked someone to prepare some ingredients. She then told Ming Yan to show off her skills for the old duchess. Ming Yan prepared some dragon beard noodles. Rolling out the dough and cooking the noodles were not skills that normal people would know. It wasn't until the finished dish was placed before old Duchess Xing that she finally believed that Chu Lian's handmaid was actually a skilled cook. Since she had proven her skill, Ming Yan was left behind to take care of old Duke Shang's meals. Old Duchess Xing also knew that this was Matriarch He's largest concession to her request, so she personally escorted Matriarch He and Chu Lian all the way to the outer court together with her daughter-in-law. Just as they were preparing to board their carriage, Zheng rushed over. Zheng was young, and good at flattery. The moment he arrived, he greeted Matriarch He and thanked Chu Lian for the feast the other day. Finally, he asked about the opening of Gillen restaurant. Chu Lian was a little surprised. Zheng, how did you know that I'm about to open up a restaurant? Zheng grinned. I heard brother he talking about it a few days ago. When the time comes, please don't forget to send me an invite, honored Lady Jeannie. Of course. So that was what had happened. Chu Lian smiled. Zheng was so straightforward that it was hard to be annoyed by him. After exchanging some pleasantries, Chu Lian followed Matriarch He back to the Jing'an estate. After he watched House Jing'an's carriage leaving the Jing estate, Zheng turned to his grandmother and mother curiously. I heard that honored Lady Jeannie left her handmaid behind in our estate. What happened? When Duchess Xing heard his question, she glared at him. You keep playing around and skiving off on your work just to pry into small matters like this. Why do you want to know all these things? Zheng had always had a sweet tongue around others, especially senior members like his mother and grandmother. He hugged Duchess Shang's arm. Mother, like you said, it's just a small matter. Since it's something small, just tell me then I won't have to go and ask other people. Duchess Xing only had one son, so she normally pampered him a lot. She looked at her son helplessly before poking him in the forehead. The handmaid that honored Lady Jeannie left behind is good at cooking. She's here to take care of your grandfather, so don't go around making trouble for her. Zheng was surprised by this answer. Good at cooking. Then how is she compared to honored Lady Jeannie? Old Duchess Xing glared at her grandson. How could she be compared to honored Lady Jeannie? She was taught by the honored lady herself. Didn't you say that you've tasted the honored lady's skills? If you try that handmaid's cooking in the future, then you'll know for yourself. When Zheng heard this, he couldn't help but grow excited. With the meal he'd had back at the Jing'an estate, it was no surprise that he had some high expectations. It was already late afternoon by the time Matriarch He and Chu Lian finally returned to the Jing'an estate. Chu Lian escorted Matriarch He back to Qingxi Hall first. Right before she left, Matriarch He sent all the servants out of the room. She held Chu Lian's hand and spoke intimately with her. You silly child. How could you send your handmaid off just like that? Now there's one less person serving you. How about having grandmother's Muxiang serve you? TL note, Ming Yan was able to prove herself to old Duchess Xing because dragon beard noodles aren't easy to make. Here's a video of someone making dragon beard noodles, https://YouTube. B/DGRP7FVB2HG. T equals 156 Dragon Beard Noodles. On a side note, the method of making those noodles is similar to Dragon's Beard candy, which is one of my favorite snacks. I just bought some on my holiday too. 3 fine cotton candy strands wrapped around ground peanut stuffing. Yum yum. Dragon's Beard candy. Chapter 230, filled with their own thoughts. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Muxiang was one of Matriarchy's most trusted handmaids. How could Chu Lian accept her offer? She shook her head. Her bright eyes glimmered, full of spirit and affection. Grandmother, I'm not lacking for help. Furthermore, I'm the only one they have to serve in Songtao Court since my husband isn't around. There's no need to have so many servants just for me alone. Before Sanlang went off to the northern border, he even sent over Wenqing, Wenlan, and even senior servant Zhong for me. Even if Mingyan is going away, Wenqing can just take her place. After some thought, Matriarchy came to the same conclusion. Chu Lian did have more than enough people to serve her since Wenqing and Wenlan had been added in. Since that was the case, she dropped the issue. Alright, since you have enough people on your side, grandmother won't give Muxiang to you then. You did very well today. Even if that Mingyan decides to come back later on, think of a way to dismiss her from her service anyway. At least that other girl Xian seems to be more grateful. Matriarch completely exposed Chu Lian's intentions in offering that choice to her handmaids. Chu Lian smiled sweetly. Grandmother's eyes are as sharp as ever. Upon seeing her sweet smile, Matriarch reached out to poke her the forehead. I wasn't aware you were so good at reading people. That's good. These handmaids are meant to be our trusted servants. We can't keep those who harbor straying thoughts by our sides. Chu Lian nodded in agreement. After they finished their conversation, Chu Lian returned to Songtao Court with Xian in tow. Xian felt a sense of pride welling up in her as she followed behind Chu Lian. Third young madam really trusted her now. When they returned to Songtao Court, in just a short moment's time, the news that Mingyan had stayed behind to take care of old Duke Xing had spread. All the maidservants in the courtyard had uncertain expressions on their faces as all sorts of thoughts ran through their heads. Chu Lian handed down some orders to senior servant Gui and Xian before heading into her bedroom for some rest. Mingyan wasn't here anymore, so there was an empty position of a first-ranked handmaid to fill. After senior servant Gui and senior servant Zhong discussed the matter, they let Wenqing take up Mingyan's place. Her new responsibility was to take over Mingyan's work. Wenqing and Wenlan had been second-class maidservants. Now that Wenqing had been promoted to a first-class personal handmaid, senior servant Gui promoted a few more third-class maidservants to second-class to fill the gap. In the end, even the little menial servant girl who had been in charge of sweeping the courtyard, Bai Cha, had been promoted to third class by this ripple effect. Bai Cha hadn't thought she'd ever get such an unexpected windfall. The moment it was announced, she looked like she was going to cry tears of joy right then and there, but was ultimately persuaded not to. Now that the ranks of the courtyard had been settled, senior servant Gui dismissed everyone with a wave of her hand and they all returned to their duties. Chu Lian's handmaids usually took turns in shifts. Xian and Fuyan were originally paired together while Mingyan and Jingyan took the other pair. However, now that Mingyan had been left in the Jing estate and Xian had just come back from serving Chu Lian, today's shift was taken up by Fuyan and Jingyan. It was in the middle of the afternoon and it wasn't time for afternoon tea yet, so most of the servants in Songtao Court were resting in their own rooms. Chu Lian was also having a nice nap in her own room. Senior servants Gui and Zhong brought Wenqing and Wenlan over to Xian's room with the intent of asking about the details of what had happened at the Jing estate. In a small room off to the side of Chu Lian's bedroom, Fuyan and Jingyan were sitting on standby while drinking tea and eating some snacks. Jingyan sipped a mouthful of sincha before sighing in a brooding manner. Mingyan's so lucky. She and Mingyan had both been sent to Chu Lian to serve as part of the dowry right before the wedding. The two girls weren't family servants and had been bought from an outside slave trader. Chu Lian's stepmother had bought her a pair of outsiders. On initial glance, it was a kindness, but it was actually the reverse. Why would Chu Lian's stepmother be so nice as to give her valuable servants from the Ying family's pool? Servants who would be loyal to the Chu family as well as already educated on noble family customs and manners. She wasn't. Hence, Chu Lian ended up with Mingyan and Jingyan as part of her dowry. Fuyan shot a glance at Jingyan. It's all up to luck for these kinds of things. We didn't know there would be such a great chance for us before third young madam left for the Zheng estate. That's true. If she had known earlier, she would have fought to be one of the servants accompanying third young madam today. Jingyan pressed her lips together in frustration. If she had taken Mingyan's place and followed third young madam out today, she would have been the one left behind. This was House Xing they were talking about. Furthermore, she would have been put in charge of old Duke Zheng's meals. She knew how to cook all the same dishes that Mingyan knew, too. Setting aside how rich House Xing was, old Duke Zheng was someone that even the emperor respected. If she served him well and received the old duke's favor, she might even be adopted as his daughter. And even if she had to return to the Jingyan estate, she would have a higher status. She wouldn't just be a simple maidservant like Shiyan and Fuyan. Other than that, House Xing only had a single son for 3 generations. This son was the current heir Zheng, who also just happened to be in the prime of his life. A ripe time for marriage. Heir Zheng was currently studying in the Imperial College. He had a carefree and elegant bearing. The last time he had come to the Jingyan estate as a guest, he hadn't entered the inner court. Otherwise, she would have definitely found a chance to peek at him. Fuyan sent a disdainful look at Jingyan. She was looking down on her for being short-sighted. It couldn't be helped since she was bought from outside. Just a little bit of wealth had completely mesmerized her. She wasn't fit to carry heavier responsibilities at all. What a waste of third young madam's guidance. Due to Jingyan's depression, she couldn't even bear to continue eating her snacks. Sounded just as down as she looked. Fuyan, don't you want to go to the Zheng estate too? Fuyan tossed the remaining fried fish skin and peanuts she was holding back into the porcelain dish on the table. She dusted off her hands and stood up. I don't want to, I've been serving by third young madam's side since I was little. Who would bother with that little bit of credit from serving old Duke Zheng? Only you girls who came later would be so short-sighted. Then, she turned around and went back to the outer chamber of Chu Lian's room to wait for her master's orders. Chapter 231, Filled with Their Own Thoughts. 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Jingyan hadn't expected Fuyan to speak like that. It lit a fuse in her, making her grit her teeth in frustration as she pointed a trembling finger at Fuyan's departing back. However, she didn't dare to scold Fuyan either. There were quite a few other maidservants outside, after all. In the end, Jingyan could only scold Fuyan in her mind for being a fake. Fuyan was clearly dead envious on the inside, but on the surface, she still acted like she could care less. What a fraud! What could they gain from staying here in the inner court of the Jingyan estate? Their young master was far off at the borders, and the main branch of this family wasn't close to theirs either. The young master of the second branch only came back to the estate once or twice a month, so they didn't even have the chance to get close to him. Later on, when they came of suitable age, if third young madam was happy with their service, she would bestow them to a steward of the estate. If she wasn't happy, then she might even marry them off to some menial manservant, to toil away for the rest of their days in poverty. Mingyan was so lucky to have met such a good chance. Even if she couldn't get into Zhang's bed, she might be able to get married to a minor official instead and become an official's legitimate wife. As for her, she could only stay by third young madam's side, toiling away her days in this Songtao court. What kind of future could she have? Mingyan's sudden departure had caused all sorts of hidden thoughts to surface in Jingyan's mind. Meanwhile, as Fuyan continued walking towards the parlor, she kept up her calm exterior despite no longer being in front of Jingyan. But in reality, how could she not be boiling with jealousy of Mingyan? However, there were other thoughts in her mind that kept her more patient than Jingyan. When she thought of Yi Changdi's outstanding figure and his handsome looks, as well as that strangely attractive cold demeanor and somber air of his, Fuyan was filled with excitement. She was going to wait, no matter how many years it took. She was going to wait until the day that third young master returned. With that letter in her hands, she was certain that she would be able to get third young master's favor. Meanwhile, Chu Lian was lying in her soft bed, covered in a fragrant, light blanket. She was deep in a comforting slumber, without any mind to care about what the maidservants in her courtyard were thinking about. In the following days, Chu Lian was kept busy with the opening of Gillen Restaurant. Time flew by in the blink of an eye, and before they knew it, there was only one day left before the 1st of September, the day of Gillen Restaurant's reopening. Mingyan had already been left in the Zheng estate to take care of old Duke Zheng's meals for about 6 days. After eating the delicious food that Mingyan had personally cooked, old Duke Zheng's spirit was back. In just a few days, he had already recovered to his usual state of health. By the 4th day, he was already able to get out of bed and move around. When it came to the 6th day, he could get up in the morning to practice the 5 animal exercises of Qigong. On this day, Zheng had come over to his grandfather's courtyard early in the morning. Old Duke Zheng had just changed into a short-sleeved tunic and was about to do some morning exercise when he saw that his grandson had come to visit him. He cheerfully extended an invitation to him and said, "Tiancheng, come and practice some techniques with me." Upon receiving his grandfather's invitation, Zheng grinned widely, showing off his teeth. He immediately took off his outer robe and tossed it to his manservant. Then, he strode over to his grandfather's side and started practicing some morning exercises with old Duke Zheng. "You brat, why have you come over to grandfather's place so early in the morning? Are you here to steal a free meal?" Old Duke Zheng harumphed. Zheng was a talkative one. Grandfather understands grandson the most. But grandson isn't here just to fulfill some simple appetite today. "Oh. What's the matter? Tell me." Old Duke Zheng was full of energy. His punches were brimming with power. There was no trace of the man who had been on his deathbed just 6 days ago after almost starving to death. The power of gourmet food was really quite miraculous. House Jingyan's third young madam, otherwise known as Honored Lady Jeannie, is about to open up a restaurant tomorrow. If grandfather would like to go and take a look, grandson happens to have 2 invites here. Honored Lady Jeannie is that girl who came to our estate with matriarchy the other day. Indeed she is. That favored maidservant you have here was left behind by Honored Lady Jeannie. That does sound interesting. Leave 1 invite for grandfather then. Zheng was so happy that even his eyebrows were beaming. After grandfather and grandson finished an hour of exercise together and took a shower, a senior servant entered the room to inform them that breakfast was ready. Old Duke Zheng brought his grandson to the parlor, where the table had been laid out with a variety of dishes. There were steamed rice cakes, flour rolls, steamed dumplings, fried breadsticks, and also some steaming hot pork porridge. They could smell the tempting aroma of the food even from the entrance of the parlor. The 2 men were already starving, so they quickly walked right in and sat at the table. As old Duke Zheng looked over the table laden with breakfast foods he had never seen before, a passionate fire seemed to be burning in his eyes. He shot a look at Mingyan, who was waiting by his side. "Mingyan, quick, tell me what all these are." After old Duke Xing spoke up, Jing turned to look at Ming Yan, who was standing by the table. When Ming Yan caught sight of Jing's gaze from the corner of her eyes, a faint blush covered her cheeks. However, she still managed to say, replying to old Duke Xing and Jing, the plate over on that end contains a dish called double golden spears. It's crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. Ming Yan's gentle voice resounded within the parlor, but as Jing continued listening, he sensed something wrong. Although this girl was introducing the dishes properly, there wasn't any mention of honored Lady Jeannie in her descriptions. By excluding her, Ming Yan was trying to imply that she had been the one to invent all these dishes. How was that possible? Zhang's brows furrowed together as he took another look at Ming Yan. This time, Ming Yan also turned to meet his gaze. Her eyes were flush with desire, like a soft autumn wind. Zhang stiffened and quickly turned his gaze away. Of course, all these little interactions had fallen into old Duke Zheng's sharp eyes. TL note: the morning exercises that old Duke Zheng is practicing are the 5 animal exercises of Qigong, based on the tiger, deer, bear, monkey and crane. https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/5_animals #5animal_exercise_in_present day_Qigong. There are all sorts of steamed rice cakes and the author didn't specify which type they're eating, so I picked one that's normally eaten as breakfast. Steamed rice cakes. Flour rolls make an appearance again. Flour rolls. Steamed dumplings. Chinese fried breadsticks, also known as youtiao, are one of my favorite breakfast foods. They taste amazing when dipped in some warm soy milk. Fried breadsticks aka youtiao, another great and healthy breakfast food. Usually topped with slices of youtiao. 3 pork porridge with century egg. Chapter 232, Promotion 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. There was an old senior servant standing behind old Duke Xing who served old Duchess Xing. She also had the wisdom and sharp eyesight that came with age. Zhang had recently started to come to old Duke Xing's courtyard for breakfast more often. In the past few days, this maidservant that honored Lady Jeannie had left behind had always quietly retreated back into the outer chamber of the parlor after bringing the food in. She would wait for old Duke Zheng's summons before coming back in. However, ever since Zheng had started coming over for breakfast, this maidservant began to stay by the table instead of leaving after laying out the dishes. Once the heir entered the room, her eyes would be stuck onto him, as if no one else existed. Her desires were so obvious that the old senior servant felt the urge to snort. The old senior servant had also tried placing her own subordinates by Ming Yan's side to learn from her cooking these past few days, thinking that Ming Yan wouldn't notice. However, Ming Yan was still rather careful. When cooking, she actually sent everyone else out of the kitchen and even locked the door. She would rather cook everything herself and guard every single secret recipe than to let others steal her secrets. When old Duke Xing finished listening to Ming Yan's explanations, he waved her away. "You're dismissed." Ah. Ming Yan was caught off guard by the sudden change. In a dazed manner, she said, "How about letting this servant serve your grace at the table? In the Jingyan estate, honored lady likes this servant's service the most." The old senior servant sneered. So she finally remembered honored Lady Jeannie. Why hadn't she mentioned honored Lady Jeannie at all when she was explaining those dishes? Old Duke Xing suddenly looked at Ming Yan with a frown. His eagle eyes carried an edge that stripped away all pretenses from their target. Ming Yan couldn't hold back the urge to tremble with fear and quickly retreated with her head down. Old Duke Xing cast a glance at Ming Yan's back. What was that young lady thinking, sending her least loyal maidservant to him? Was she treating him like a test? Was that young lady satisfied with this result? When old Duke Xing thought back to those words that Chu Lian had spoken to lure him out of his coma, his interest in her grew more and more. It seemed like he really did had to go and see for himself what skills that young lady had in store. By the time both grandfather and grandson had finished their meal and allowed the servants to clear the table, the younger Duke Xing had arrived. When Duke Xing saw that his son was at his father's place again, his brows furrowed together. "What time is it already? Why aren't you going over to the Imperial College yet? Your grandfather has just recovered. In the future, you're not allowed to come over in the morning and disturb your grandfather." Zheng pouted and ran off in the blink of an eye. House Shang had been succeeded by only sons for 3 generations. Their family rules were actually very strict. Although Zheng was pampered by his family, Duke Sheng was a strict parent. Case in point, Zheng was already 17 this year, but the servants in his courtyard were all male. He didn't have a single maidservant for his nightly needs, and was a genuine virgin. Duke Sheng had already noticed that the maidservant honored Lady Jeannie had left behind to cook old Duke Sheng's meals had impure motives, so how could he possibly give her a chance to get close to his son? Old Duke Sheng glanced at his son and pointed at the seat next to him. "You've come. Sit down, how's that matter I entrusted to you?" Duke Sheng took up a teacup and sipped some tea. Then, he nodded once and said, "I've already completed the tasks you've entrusted to me." Old Duke Xing leaned against the back of his chair and played with a pair of walnuts in his hands. He closed his eyes, appearing quite fatigued. TL note, you didn't read wrongly, Old Duke is playing with walnuts, actual walnuts. So walnuts have apparently been a big thing in China since the ancient times and have been making a comeback recently. They're seen as a symbol of status and are a popular gift amongst the rich and elite. The best of walnuts have to be large and as symmetrical as possible with lots of ridges. I found an interesting news article about walnut farmers, https://www. The Star. com my/business/business news/2014/10/14/ money grows on trees with great walnuts of China/ and this is what they look like, fancy walnuts. Chapter 233, Promotion, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. Duke Xing paused for a moment before saying, "Father, why did you suddenly think of the He family's third son? Even if mother and matriarch are old friends, our houses have always maintained a distance. If father wants to repay honored Lady Jeannie's favor, then there are still plenty of other opportunities to do so." Old Duke Xing shook his head. "It's a simple thing that doesn't require any effort from me. Just let that girl reap some benefit from this. Don't worry. Father won't interfere in any more of House Jingin's matters." After hearing such a promise from his father, Duke Xing finally relaxed. Although his father had a distinguished reputation, he had already retired from the court. If he continued interfering in political matters, it would definitely draw protests from others. It was nightfall at the northern border of Liangzhou. The setting sun dyed the brown grasses of the plains golden. Although it was a bitterly poor place, the breathtaking scenery still brought joy to the residents' hearts. Not far off, this golden sunlight fell upon 2 men, drawing out long shadows on the dried grassy plains. A cold wind blew past, lifting up the ends of their robes. Seen from afar, it seemed as if they were standing on the edge of the horizon, taking step after step towards the fading light of hope. Liyue rushed forward to catch up to his master. He hadn't followed He Changdi when he had gone to join the northern border troops. Instead, he stayed behind in the city of Liangzhou to help his master handle other affairs. It was a rest day for the whole camp today, so Liyue brought some necessities for his master over to the entrance of the camp. It was only when he reached the camp that he discovered that his master had been promoted. He had gone from a lieutenant leading 100 men to a captain leading 500 men. Although it was only an additional 400 men under his command, it was still a huge transformation. A lieutenant could be called an officer, but could also be considered a slightly more elite soldier, as they only commanded a mere 100 men. However, captains were different. They carried a rank with them. Of course, Heartchang's position of commanding 500 infantry couldn't be compared to Captain Gua's position as a commander of cavalry. However, he was still considered a mid-ranked officer now, with an official 6th-ranked title. In peacetime, it would normally be hard for soldiers to get promoted to a higher rank. What's more, it was under the command of the strict general of the northern border, Duke Liu. Luck like this was extremely hard to come by. Liu was immersed in joy. His master's efforts hadn't been wasted, and he could finally hold up House Jing'an's name as a military official family. If he reported this matter in his letters to home, matriarch, he would probably be overcome with joy. If third young master got promoted again, third young madam might even be able to become a titled noble wife. With these thoughts, the corners of Liu's mouth unconsciously curled into a smile. However, when he saw that his master's expression was as cold as usual, he was a little confused. Liu came over to his master's side. Third young master, where are we going? It's a rare break for you. Aren't we going back to our courtyard in the city for a good rest? Heartchang looked up at the old tent fluttering in the wind up ahead. He didn't reply Liu, but asked instead, have you received any letters from the capital? Liu had been serving Heartchang for years. He understood that his master didn't want to answer his question, so he dropped the issue. Judging by the time that has passed, we should be receiving letters from the capital in the next 2 days. Heartchang nodded and sunk back into his silence. As they continued on their way, he didn't say anything more. Liu's thoughts were a jumbled mess as they tumbled around in his mind. What was wrong with his master? Hadn't he gotten promoted? Why was his expression still so dark, as if everyone owed him a few thousand taels? TL note, our cute author wrote this little scene at the bottom of the chapter. The chapters have also been getting a little shorter than usual. Author's note, mini theater, in a small dark room. He Sanlang, let me out, let me out. Snow Mountain Mists, wielding a whip, what are you shouting for? He Sanlang, Snow Mountain Mists, if you don't let me out, I'm going to kill you. Don't you know I'm a Reincarnator? Snow Mountain Mists, what are you so anxious for? I'm your mother, I know everything. I've only kept you locked up for a few chapters and you're already this impatient. How are you going to bear greater responsibilities in the future? He Sanlang, drawing his sword, what greater responsibilities? My wife is about to run off with someone else, how are you going to make this up to me? Snow Mountain Mists, carefully avoiding the sword, fine, I'm going to grant you some mercy and let you out to play for a while. Chapter 234, Alma 1, this chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Heartchang turned his gaze towards the horizon. Though his footsteps remained steady, his thoughts had already drifted far away. Other than Duke Liu and himself, even Captain Gua didn't know the real reason for his sudden promotion. Even though he had been performing exceptionally in the army, he wasn't the only one. He wasn't as silly as to think that this was some special treatment gifted from the heavens because of his reincarnation. He knew clearly what the personality of Duke Liu, also known as Great General Qian, was like after living 2 lifetimes. Even if General Qian's very own son came to this army, then he would still have to start from the lowest rank amongst soldiers. Furthermore, the general's demands would be even stricter. Since that was the case for the general's own flesh and blood, then some stranger like him would never receive any preferential treatment. Getting to work under Captain Gua and rising to the post of lieutenant in such a short time was already quite the feat that was also due to a combination of his previous life's memories and the help of Prince Jean. He had been able to meet Great General Qian once more thanks to that grape wine Chu Lian had sent over. But although General Qian loved wine, he definitely wouldn't promote him based on that alone. Thus, when Captain Gua had informed him that he had been promoted to a captain of the infantry, even Changdi himself had been surprised. At that moment, he had immediately requested to meet General Qian. General Qian wasn't someone who liked to hide things, so he immediately revealed that it was old Duke Zheng who had sent him a letter and requested for his promotion. Old Duke Zheng had been General Qian's teacher in the past. His teacher had sent him a letter all the way from the capital just to tell him to give He Sanlang a chance. How could he not accept his teacher's request and do this small favor for him? Furthermore, old Duke Zheng was the person that General Qian respected most in his life. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that if his own father gave an order, General Qian might not even listen, but if it were old Duke Zheng, then his words were like law. No matter what, General Qian would do his best to execute his orders. Old Duke Zheng rarely requested favors from others, too, so General Qian couldn't just ignore the request. However, Changdi wasn't stupid. He wouldn't reject the promotion due to some misplaced sense of pride. As his rank grew higher, it meant that his starting point was placed even closer to his end goal, and he would be able to achieve his desires even faster. He just didn't want to be someone blissfully unaware. There was always a reason behind abnormal situations. Although his grandmother was close with old Duchess Zheng and they interacted often, that was only between the two old matriarchs. Their houses remained aloof to each other. In his past life, after House Jing'an had landed in such a sorry state, old Duke Zheng had never even said a single word of mercy in front of the emperor. Why would he send a letter to General Qian now to take special care of him? As much as Changdi wanted to continue asking, he knew that he wouldn't be able to find anything out from General Qian. Firstly, without considering whether General Qian even knew about the details behind this request, he probably wouldn't be willing to divulge them to him. After Changdi asked to be excused from General Qian's presence, he could only wait for Prince Jin's letters or any letters from home to give him some sort of an explanation. Changdi hadn't received any letters from home for quite some time. He didn't even know if that wicked woman Chu Lian had been behaving properly in the estate. If she dared to make any inappropriate moves, then he would cast her off the moment he returned to the capital. As these messy thoughts brawled back and forth inside his head, he managed to walk a rather far distance. Changdi remembered something from his previous life. A month after the autumn examinations, the Tuhan had suddenly begun to attack the northern border, the same northern border that had remained peaceful for 5 years before. General Qian had brought over his troops to suppress the invasion for 5 whole months before he succeeded in maintaining the peace. Back then, the northern border troops had suffered heavy casualties. Furthermore, it had been winter and a blizzard had sealed off the mountain area. Supplies had been cut off from Liangzhou and over 1/5 of the army had starved to death. It was only after the snows had melted and spring had come, letting supplies flow into Liangzhou once again, that the situation had eased. They then destroyed the invading Tuhans in one go. It was also in that war that the captain of the left-wing army under General Qian's command had achieved much merit and was promoted to General Chongping. This captain-turned-general had even been given a noble title. Changdi's eyes narrowed and a bright glint flashed from within his pupils. This time around, the wildlands where he'd met his end, his old place of exile, would become the same place he would start his journey from in his new life. Chapter 235, Almoth 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. After walking for another hour, the rundown old tent in the horizon was finally right before them. This was a small hillock and the old tent had been set up where the hillock blocked the wind. The broken parts of the tent had already been patched up by someone using dried grass. Not too far off from the tent was an area cordoned off by a line of short fences, corralling 2 thin-looking horses and a few old sheep. The bleating of the sheep was transmitted across the plains thanks to the blowing winds. By this time, the sky was already beginning to darken. However, there were no lights shining from the tent. As they stood outside, they could hear someone coughing and a woman speaking in a hoarse voice. Changdi's heart had long frosted over in the bleak freezing winds of Liangzhou, but it seemed like the woman's rough voice had slowly warmed it up. His eyes seemed to carry more passion than usual as he stared at the tent, which had almost been swallowed in darkness. His deep gaze was currently filled with warmth. He stood outside the tent for who knows how long. Finally, the tent flaps lifted, and a middle-aged woman walked out. Darkness had already fallen. Clothed in some thick furs and fabric, the woman couldn't even see the newcomer's face. She could only vaguely make out a rough silhouette. "Ah-ma," Changdi mumbled from the corner of his mouth. The middle-aged woman had just come out to toss some water and wash some bowls. When she looked up only to see two dark shapes standing not too far away, she cried out sharply and fell to the ground. Changdi quickly went forward to help her up. Up close, the middle-aged woman could finally identify the silhouettes as two young Han. She immediately relaxed and tried speaking to them in the barbarian language. Changdi replied to her in the same language. He was so fluent that he sounded exactly like someone born to it. The middle-aged woman then happily welcomed Changdi and Liuyue into the tent to talk. The barbarians living out here in the borders of Liangzhou were always friendly and welcoming. They would treat those who could speak their language like their own family, with honesty and enthusiasm. This quality of theirs, whether in his past life or present one, had never changed. It was also due to this fact that they lacked caution against others, and in a few years, would be completely decimated by the Tuhan. The middle-aged woman lifted up the tent flap, and a strange odor immediately filled Changdi and Liuyue's nostrils. This was due to the tent not being aired out for a long period of time, keeping all sorts of moldy, stale smells within. Liuyue couldn't resist the urge to pinch his nose. When he turned to look at his master, he found that Changdi's calm expression hadn't changed a single bit, as if he was already used to this nausea-inducing odor. When Liuyue saw his master's calm, he could only lower his hand and bear with the odor as much as he could. There were no lights in the tent, so it was even darker inside. Changdi turned around to give Liuyue an order: light a lantern. Liuyue felt his way to the short table placed in the middle of the tent before taking out an oil lantern from his bag and lighting it up. With the flickering light of the lantern, the dark insides of the tent were instantly filled with a yellow glow. Using that dim light, Changdi could finally see his surroundings clearly, including the face of the barbarian woman standing across from him. The barbarian woman's eyes had widened and she was looking at that small oil lantern in disbelief. After staring in a daze for a moment, she quickly waved her hands and reached out to extinguish the lantern's flame. "Sai, there's no need to light a lantern, lantern oil is very expensive," the barbarian woman said anxiously. Sai was a respectful term for esteemed gentleman in the barbarian language. The barbarians worked only by the natural light of the sun and slept when the sun set. They didn't have any money to spare for luxuries like lantern oil. To buy a lantern and the fuel needed for one, they would have to visit a Han family or go to the Tuhan markets. Furthermore, a single bottle of lantern oil cost half a sheep. Most barbarians wouldn't be able to afford one. Lantern oil was an absolute luxury for them. TL note, the term the author used is man-ren, the man-people, or literally, barbarian, in modern Chinese. Author's note, apologies, dear readers. I was busy today so I could only write so much. There'll be more tomorrow. Also, the barbarians and barbarian language mentioned in this story are all invented by me, so please don't take it for real. Chapter 236, Blank 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Changdi held the barbarian woman back and shook his head. Then, he began to explain something to her in the barbarian language. The barbarian woman shot a careful look at Changdi before agreeing not to extinguish the lantern with a worried heart. She anxiously stood up, intending to warm up some sheep milk for Heechangdi. This time, Heechangdi didn't stop her. It wasn't until the barbarian woman had left the tent that Heechangdi started to scrutinize the insides of this broken old tent. There was a blanket covered by a fur skin in a corner of the tent. 2 young boys were sleeping on top of it, one older and one younger. The older one looked to be 17 or 18 at most. The younger was most likely not even older than 10. The 2 boys had pale faces and were both clearly sick. Other than that strong odor of mold in the tent, there was also the light scent of medicinal herbs. The younger child was still sleeping at this moment. However, the older one had been staring at Heechangdi with eyes full of caution ever since he had stepped foot into the tent. Heechangdi's usually icy expression suddenly turned into a smile. Coupled with the warm glow of the lantern, highlighting his handsome features, he seemed like a deity who had descended onto this mortal earth. The young man lying in bed seemed a little dazed from this sight. Murin. This young man seemed exactly the same as the first time they had met in his previous life. Even the caution in his eyes hadn't changed. However, in his past life, they had met in the lands of exile he had been sent to, whereas now they were meeting in this small, simple tent. In his past life, this young man had stood in front of him as a shield, but had been killed by the steel wielded by the guards supervising him. In this life, he had come to meet him 3 years early in order to protect him and his family. By the time Heechangdi led Liyue out of the tent, stars had filled up the night sky. Even Liyue, who didn't know the barbarian language, had found out that the barbarian woman was called Wulihin, while the 2 boys were called Murin and Narisong. The middle-aged Wulihin escorted Heechangdi far away from the tent, before watching as his back disappeared beyond the horizon of the plains. It was only then that she returned home. Liyue followed Heechangdi under the light of the stars. Although he was curious as to why his master wanted to help a widowed barbarian woman and her children, it seemed like his master had too many thoughts on his mind to pay attention to him. Their silence persisted until master and servant returned to the little courtyard they had bought in Liangzhou City. Liyue had been living in the little courtyard all this time, so it was kept very clean. Most of the things required for normal day-to-day living were also already present, so they could stay there immediately. Heechangdi had only returned for barely a moment when an average-looking man leaped into the courtyard and personally passed a blue cloth bag into Heechangdi's hands. Liyue's face was filled with joy. "Third young master, it's a package from the capital." As Heechangdi held the package, for some reason, there was a strange sense of expectation in his heart, but even he didn't know what he was expecting to see inside. Liyue followed closely behind his master, waiting for his master to open up the package so he could peek inside as well. If there was jerky inside from third young madam, then his master would definitely share some with him. However, who could have expected Sanlang to carry the package into his room, locking Liyue outside of the door. The moment Heechangdi entered his room, his long legs unconsciously walked faster in order to reach the table in record time. Next, he unwrapped the package at lightning speed. Heechangdi was stunned. He stared at the contents for more than a few seconds before he finally managed to react. A bad premonition rose in his heart. Once he recovered his senses, he pulled out everything inside. This package wasn't like the previous one. Not only was there not a single snack inside, there weren't even any carefully packed pieces of clothing within. When he opened the package, there were only a few winter tunics inside. Even though they were made of fine fabrics and looked luxurious, he couldn't wear this type of fabric and styles at the northern border. Heechangdi couldn't help but remember the last package from home he had received. The previous package had contained bruise balm, waterproof leather boots, comfortable inner clothes, short tunics for martial arts practice, and even wrist and shin guards. Although there were only a few of each item, they were all things he needed. Even those he hadn't thought of were there. Liyue had said that the wicked woman Chu Lian had prepared those for him. Having experienced that sort of care and consideration, Changdi felt an unexpected sense of disappointment after looking at the small package he had just received. Sanlang pressed his lips together and suppressed that strange feeling welling up within him. He reached out to move aside the clothing at the top of the package and took out the wooden box below containing letters from the capital. When he opened the wooden box, his hands were unconsciously trembling and his heart was filled with a sense of uncertainty. However, the moment he lifted the lid of the fragrant rosewood box, the first thing he saw was the giant leather envelope placed at the very bottom. That wicked woman. Had she drawn more letters for him? Humph. All she knew was how to skive. Sanlang was alone in the room now. If Liyue had been there, he would have definitely caught a shocking, faint smile on his master's face. Changdi pushed aside the letters on top and took the giant leather envelope out of the box. His slender fingers flipped it over, every movement carrying a sense of urgency. However, upon removing the stack of paper, Changdi wordlessly stared at them for a good 10 whole seconds. His originally warm eyes frosted over with anger. Finally, his handsome face turned dark and gloomy at a speed that human eyes could barely see. However, with the addition of his thick beard, his expression seemed a little funny instead. After a few more seconds, Sanlang threw the stack of papers to the ground in a fit, and even stomped all over them. Those papers that had been tossed to the ground were actually all blank. Sanlang felt like his lungs were about to burst from anger. That wicked woman. How dare she? In order to deal with him, she had actually sent him blank pages. Sanlang hated that he couldn't just appear in front of Chu Lian and grab her or recklessly bully her for a bit, so that she would finally know her duties as a man's wife. The impatient, moody Sanlang paced about his room. If not for his extraordinary patience, this room would have already been destroyed to bits. Chapter 237, blank, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Back at the Jing'an estate, Chu Lian was currently lying in bed in Songtao Court. She flipped over and sighed in relaxation. She had completely forgotten about the fact that she had sent Sanlang a bunch of blank pages. When the main steward had personally come over to ask for Songtao Court's portion of the letters for Sanlang, Chu Lian had asked if Changdi had sent any replies back. The steward had hemmed and hawed for a long time before revealing that the young master hadn't sent a reply. Chu Lian had rolled her eyes on the spot. She had then entered her study, folded up a few pieces of blank paper and given them to the steward. An eye for an eye. Sanlang had to dream on if he thought she would send him letters when he hadn't replied to hers. Meanwhile, Sanlang didn't realize that it was his own fault that he had gotten a blank reply. Liyue was guarding his young master's door. He listened to the pacing footsteps of his young master and wondered as he pricked his ears, is third young master so happy that he got a letter from third young madam that he can't sleep? It wasn't until 15 minutes later that Changdi finally managed to calm his anger. He sat back at the table and tore the rest of his letters open. After reading through them, his brows started to furrow together. It hadn't been as peaceful as he thought back at the capital. That wicked woman Chu Lian alone had done quite a lot. She had actually gotten a title for herself, and had even been personally named by the emperor. She had gone to the palace's mid-autumn banquet with grandmother. Even old Duke Sheng's recovery had something to do with her. Furthermore, she was going to open a restaurant, and it was actually the one that grandmother had long given up on. For some reason, Changdi started to remember the joking words that Liyue had used earlier today. Third young master is rising up the ranks so quickly. Maybe third young master will become a general in a few more months and third young madam will become a titled noble wife. It was a matter of pride and glory for a husband to earn a noble title for his wife through his own hard work and achievements. However, that woman had somehow managed to earn a noble title for herself without him playing any part in it. He shouldn't even care, but for some reason, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dissatisfaction with himself. Sanlang swore in his heart that he definitely had to become a high-ranked official in the future. He was going to get a first-ranked noble title for her and beat that stupid honored lady name. He was going to let the whole world know that she was Sanlang's wife, and not some rubbish honored lady genie. Immersed in his rage, Sanlang didn't realize that his feelings about Chu Lian had changed from wanting to divorce her, to working hard in order to get her a first-ranked noble title. Of all these letters, Prince Jin's letter contained the most details. After reading everything, Changdi eventually managed to restrain the tumultuous feelings in his heart and think. He finally realized why he had mysteriously gotten a promotion. After finding out that it was all thanks to Chu Lian, Changdi didn't even know how to name the emotions sitting inside his heart right now. All he knew was that the only thing he wanted to do now was to grab that wicked woman and sit her down before him so he could question her on what she was trying to do. In the murky depths of his mind, something was slowly starting to change. Was she really trying to help him? Why? Wasn't Xiao Wujing the one she really liked? Changdi was completely confused and disconcerted. He took in a deep breath. By the time he managed to settle his thoughts, half of the night had already passed. He personally changed the room's candle and adjusted the wick before sitting back at the table and taking out a sheet of paper. Perhaps due to calming himself down earlier, his writing wasn't as wild and crazy like the scribblings on the last letter he had sent. This time, he set his brush to paper with firm and forceful strokes. It was only when the first light of dawn started creeping up from the east that Sanlang laid down on his bed, exhausted. There were 3 envelopes on the table. The one on the bottom was the fattest and probably contained about 7 or 8 pieces of paper inside. On the outside of the envelope were the words, "To my dear wife, Madam Chu." In the blink of an eye, it was already the 1st of September. It was already deep autumn. The weather was also starting to cool down, especially in the early morning and night. The best thing to do during this kind of weather was to stay in bed all day. It wasn't too cold or too hot. There was a slight warmth encasing the room, making it very comfortable. Chu Lian was wrapped up in a soft brocade blanket, half of her porcelain white face and flushed red cheeks peeking above the hem of the blanket. Her breaths were long and even, indicating that she was in deep slumber. When senior servant Gue and Xian entered the room, this was the scene that greeted them. The corners of senior servant Gue's eyes twitched. She personally drew aside the curtains of the bedchamber and sat by the bed. She gently shook Chu Lian twice. My dear third young madam. Look at how late it is, how do you still have the mood to sleep? Chu Lian rubbed her sleep-laden eyes and asked in a careless manner, "What time is it?" Senior servant Gue's expression was about to turn dark. "Third young madam, it's already the time of the dragon." The time of the dragon. Then that was only about 7:30 in the morning in modern terms. Chu Lian shut her eyes, wanting to go back to sleep. TL note, the ancient Chinese kept time in 2-hour blocks, naming each block after an animal of the zodiac. While the dragon hour would sound better than time of the dragon, the term refers to a 2-hour block, so it's not entirely accurate. Whenever time is mentioned in the story, it's actually in the ancient Chinese time format. When it appears in narration, I try my best to translate it to a modern time. Original. Chu Lian went to Qingxi Hall at the time of the horse, between 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Translated, Chu Lian went to Qingxi Hall at 12 p.m. This makes it easier to read and understand for readers. However, whenever time is mentioned by the characters themselves, it would be weird if they used 12 p.m. or 7 a.m., so I kept it to the original, time of the dragon. Luckily, Chu Lian actually converted the time back to modern hours for us in the original text. If these ancient hours appear again in speech, I'll likely make a TL note at the bottom. If you're interested in finding out more about this time system, here's the English Wikipedia article, https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/Chinese_traditional_time_system #dual hour/sure. Note, earthly branches equals 12 zodiacs. Chapter 238, Opening 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. How could senior servant Gue let her continue sleeping? Perhaps if it was a normal day, then she would allow it as she usually did. Even the matriarch regularly doted on third young madam, exempting her from the sunrise morning call so their young madam could sleep in a little bit longer. The servants of Songtao court were no better. They sympathized with their third young madam and always let her sleep as much as she wanted. However, today was different. It was the day of Gillen Restaurant's reopening, something that third young madam had been planning for quite a few months. The matriarch was also eager to see the results of her work. Third young madam, Gillen Restaurant is reopening today. You have to go over there yourself. Senior servant Lu from Qingxi Hall even sent someone over to ask after you just now. After hearing senior servant Gui's words, Chu Lian opened her eyes and sighed. She sat up and ordered Xian to bring her clothes. While dressing herself, Chu Lian told them, Momo, you don't have to be so worried. Even if I don't go there myself today, Gillen Restaurant will still do well. How could senior servant Gui believe that? As magnificent as Gillen Restaurant was after the renovation, even though it now looked just as good or even better than that Yuehong restaurant on Zhuke Avenue, she still didn't believe that Gillen Restaurant would be able to fill its tables with customers right after opening. After all, its location was less than ideal, surrounded by residential areas and on a deserted street to boot. Senior servant Gue thought third young madam was trying to placate her like she was a naive child. When Chu Lian noticed the doubt in senior servant Gui's eyes, a corner of her lips lifted helplessly. She decided to use the results of today to prove it to her instead. Xian picked out an apricot-colored dress with plum blossoms for Chu Lian. It wasn't too outstanding, but still seemed celebratory enough due to the red plum blossoms on the skirt. Although Chu Lian wouldn't be making a public appearance at the opening, she had to personally attend to the guests she had sent invitations to. There weren't many invites, only 10 in total. She had personally written all of them. After all those months of practice, her calligraphy was finally passable enough to show. All the effort she had put into her daily calligraphy practice had paid off. Although there were only a few invites, they had all been sent to the most distinguished guests. The Jing estate and Prince Wei's estate had received 2 invites each. Lord Ge and the young Marquis Weiyuan had also received 1 each. Of the remaining 4 invites, 2 of them had gone to the Yang estate, while the other 2 had been sent to her maiden house, at the Ying estate. These were the distinguished guests that Chu Lian had invited today. Chu Lian got dressed and slowly enjoyed her breakfast without any sense of urgency. It was only after senior servant Gui's anxious urging that she finally went to Qingxi Hall. Today, it was Wenqing and Wenlan's turn to accompany Chu Lian. The other maidservants were to wait until it was close to noon before following the 2 senior servants over to Gillen Restaurant to serve their distinguished guests. Fuyan and Xian stood by one side and looked at Chu Lian's slender silhouette. Fuyan was completely dumbfounded. She clicked her tongue in admiration. Hey, why isn't our third young madam worried at all? Will that out-of-the-way restaurant really become a booming business? Xian glared at her, confidence written all over her face. Don't talk nonsense. I believe in third young madam. Fuyan was still filled with disdain in her mind. She was just speaking the truth, why was Xian stopping her? She didn't know where Xian got that self-confidence of hers. In her heart, even a person as wise as the matriarch hadn't been able to save that lousy old restaurant. How could their third young madam be even smarter than the matriarch? In the courtyard of the main branch, Madame Zhou waved her hand to dismiss the stewards who had come over to give their daily reports. A maidservant passed over a fresh cup of tea to her. Madame Zhou took the teacup and carefully sipped at it, her lips slightly curved into a smile. If she remembered correctly, today was the day that her third sister-in-law was going to reopen Gillen Restaurant. Gillen Restaurant was one of the matriarch's businesses. She knew better than anyone else about the situation of that old restaurant. She admitted that her third sister-in-law's secret recipes were really quite delicious, but the restaurant's abysmal location couldn't be denied. It was too desolate an area to attract a crowd. No one would think to walk over there just for a meal. A dead district is a dead business, what more for a restaurant? Building up a name for the restaurant wasn't something that could be achieved in just 1 or 2 days. By the time that happened, it would be too late. In the end, all of Chu Lian's hard work would have gone to naught, only for her to benefit from it. When she thought of this, Madame Zhou felt especially pleased. Today, she was waiting to see Chu Lian's disgrace. Just as her thoughts were lifting her mood, she spotted He Changqi striding out from their bedroom. When she saw that he had taken special care in dressing up today, she frowned. "Dalong, where are you going?" He Changqi straightened his collar and ordered a maidservant to bring over his breakfast. He then sat at the table and picked up some chopsticks before explaining, "Third sister-in-law's restaurant is going to open today, so I'm going there to help her out." When Madame Zhou heard this, her eyes immediately widened. "It's just a small restaurant, why do you have to be there too?" He Changqi frowned as he looked at her. Brother Gu, Tiancheng, and Marquis Wei Yuan are all going there to support the restaurant's opening. If I don't go, who's going to attend to the male guests? Madame Zhou stiffened and she looked at her own husband in disbelief. Suddenly, her heart was wavering with uncertainty. She thought back to the day that her husband had brought his friends over for a meeting and she had stolen Chu Lian's credit. Had they already known before that? When he recalled the events of that day, He Changqi lost all appetite. He set down his chopsticks and lifted the edge of his robe as he stood up. Right before he left, he shot a meaningful look at Madame Zhou. Finally, he walked right out of the courtyard without even a goodbye. Left alone in the parlor, sitting on a fragrant wood chair, Madame Zhou's face turned deathly pale. She wanted to call him back, make him turn around with a cry of "Dalong," but the word stayed stuck in her throat, even long after her husband had already left. Chapter 239, Opening 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. At Yuehong Restaurant. A lively feast was currently underway in the restaurant. People were urging their friends to drink and creating a pleasant buzz of noise. Suddenly, they heard the sounds of a commotion coming from the street outside, followed by an uproar of voices. Everyone subconsciously exchanged looks before the person closest to the windows pushed open the window pane. The cacophony from outside poured into the room. "What a huge crowd on the streets," someone said. A large man with curly whiskers roared with laughter. "What's strange about that? There's usually a crowd on the streets." Suddenly, all the people in the main hall laughed in unison. The cheeks of the person who had first spoken up flushed red. No, it seems like there's something going on. Someone's splitting up the crowd and making way for someone else. Some of them are dressed in lion dance costumes. The people of the capital all held a curious heart, no matter their status or rank. Very quickly, there were people poking their heads out to find out what the buzz on the streets was about. What a grand-looking lion dance troupe. I've never seen 6 people dancing at once. Don't tell me they've also prepared music to go along with this performance. Is it really that grand? At this time, a young man dressed in blue walked in from the entrance. The moment he entered, he started shouting, "Quick, come with me to check out the performance." I just came over from Chomping Lane and that Grand Lion dance troupe is preparing for their performance over there. The crowd couldn't hold back their curiosity. Quite a few of them came out of the restaurant and onto the streets one after another. In restaurants, Mr. Wong had still been settling some accounts at the counter of his restaurant. Following the increase in noise from outside, the originally full main hall of his restaurant suddenly emptied out. A few waiters hurriedly chased after the leaving customers to settle their bills. "What's going on?" the gray-haired Mr. Wong frowned as he asked one of his waiters. "Manager, will you allow this one to go out to check for you?" Mr. Wong waved his hand in permission. After a short moment, the waiter returned. Manager, there's something big going on outside." "What kind of event is it?" The waiter gestured with his hands as he said, "There are 6 people dressed in lion dance costumes out there, with shining lion heads this big. They even have musicians and singers behind them, all wearing the same kind of clothes, and though they look very festive, no one knows what they're going to do. They're currently finishing preparations out on the streets. It looks like the performance is going to start in a while. Manager, do you want to go out and watch too? There are lots of people outside on the streets right now." The waiter was clearly excited, and it was written all over his face, too. Mr. Wong set down the abacus in his hands and strode over to watch together with the waiter. All the customers in the restaurant had been drawn away, so they couldn't do business anyway. Why not check out what was going on outside and find out who was trying to cause trouble? When it was finally 10 a.m., the lion dance troupe gathered on Juke Avenue right outside Yuehong Restaurant suddenly began shouting together. The golden lions behind them started dancing, and following that, the music troupe behind them began to play their instruments. With the lion dancers in front and the rousing music behind, everyone was captivated. After a few beats, some of the spectators who had an interest in music began to cry out in surprise. "What tune is this? Why is it so strange yet so full of emotion?" Just as someone finished saying so, one of the musicians started singing in a rough, loud voice. "The great rivers all run to the east. The stars in the sky look up to the North Star." Right after the first line, the remaining 10 or more men in the troupe continued in a chorus, "Hey hey, look up to the North Star, a cup of wine for our sworn brothers." The leading singer continued, "If I say march, we all march. Yours and mine are all shared between us." The low and fierce chorus line shouted, "Hey hey, all shared between us, no retreat come floods or fire." Of all the people of the capital, no matter if they were nobles or commoners, this was the first time they had heard such a strange yet catchy song. These lyrics were like normal speech and the tune was easy to follow. The wild and heroic music made people's hearts soar with excitement. The crowd on the street started getting bigger and bigger as all of them tried to peek at what was going on. Someone at the front of the crowd shouted, "The lion dance troupe is moving. They're moving. Everybody make way. Make way." Amidst the bobbing heads of the crowd, someone asked, "What are they doing? Why is it so lively here?" "We don't know either. Look, the troupe is moving forward, let's follow along and see." A middle-aged man interrupted their conversation and said, That troupe looks like it's heading to the stage northwest of here. Don't tell me that it was this group of people who built it. That wooden platform was just set up a few days ago." The lyrics to the Song of Heroes were simple, and there were only 2 parts to it, yet the melody was rousing and majestic. The singing troupe had only repeated the song twice, but the crowd following behind them had already learned how to sing along. The leader of the music troupe sung once again, "When I see injustice, I roar with anger. When it's time to act, I fight. I travel the world, doing as I like." Without waiting for the chorus from the troupe, the crowd had already started chanting, "Hey hey, hey hey yo hey hey, hey hey, hey hey yo hey hey." That strange melody and magnetic song suddenly spread through the entire street in an instant. The lyrics were so easy to remember that even the little children had learned them. They ran alongside the lion dance troupe, chanting along with the singers. With the lion dancers dancing and the troupe members singing, the wide Juke Avenue was actually filled to the point that even a pebble couldn't squeeze through. Look, the lion dance troupe is finally stopping. The lion dance troupe had indeed stopped before the wooden stage that had been built beforehand. Following that, they nimbly climbed up onto it, causing the crowd to gasp in admiration. The sounds of singing and drums suddenly disappeared. At the last moment when the singing and drums stopped, the raised lion head suddenly spit out a large red scroll. TL note, Song of Heroes, or How Han Gu, is an actual song from the drama Water Margin, which is based on a famous Chinese novel about 108 outlaws who formed a brotherhood of heroes. I translated the song lyrics with the help of this Quora answer, and it also gives a more in-depth explanation of the lyrics if you want to know more. https://www. Quora.com/can someone provide an English version translation of the 90s Chinese song How Han Gu by Lu Wan? Try listening to the song yourself here. https://www. YouTube.com/watch. HL equals NGB greater than or less than equals SG and V equals H, 47S8 ES5. Finally, here's a picture of what a lion dancer looks like while spitting out a scroll. Lion dancer, try reading the chapter again with this image and the song playing. 3. Chapter 240, Becoming Famous. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Sleepy birds return to the forest at dusk, floating clouds return to the mountain when it's clear. Congratulations to Gillen Restaurant for its grand reopening. Gillen Restaurant, Gillen Restaurant. So it's Gillen Restaurant. Many of the old gourmets standing below the stage had a sudden spark of realization. Following that, they shouted out in excitement. Others in the crowd stared strangely at the old foodies. A white-bearded old gourmand posed in deep thought as he stroked his beard. He made sure that the people around him were itching with curiosity before he started speaking. This Gillen Restaurant is one of the old well-known restaurants in the capital. It's located where the entrance of the Old West Market used to be. So it was a restaurant. The crowd finally realized what was going on. After such a huge buzz, it was just a restaurant. And here they were thinking that it was some grand event. The news spread quickly, and the originally festive atmosphere brought about by the lion dancers and the lively song dampened a little. Some people reacted with disdain. I was wondering what was going on. So it's just the opening of a restaurant, and an old poor one at that. It's even located in that desolate Old West Market. Does the owner of the restaurant even know how to do business? Who's going to go to a place like that? A restaurant. They actually dared to open a restaurant. There are already over 10 or more famous restaurants on Juke Avenue alone. They're really overestimating themselves. I think we can all just leave now. What else are you waiting for? Let's go, let's go. Not far off, the watching manager Chin smirked. By this time, a young server had come up to greet him. Master Chin. Is everything ready? The server stood to the side and revealed the things arranged behind him. The other 5 points in the city are also ready. Manager Chin's gaze landed on the 3 mid-sized jars behind the server and he nodded at the young man. Bring them up. The server immediately called up a few men behind him to help. Just as the crowd was about to disperse, Manager Chin walked up onto the stage. The moment he entered the stage, the drummers and the troupe hit their drums with 2 forceful strokes. The crowd's attention was once again drawn to the stage. Manager Chin was dressed in a sapphire blue brocade robe. His black hair was tucked away neatly into his headpiece. Dressed as he was, he didn't seem like a servant, rather, he seemed more like a scholar. Manager Chin was someone who knew how to give off a good impression. He bowed slightly in a semicircle facing the crowd, instantly drawing their favor. With a slightly raised voice, he said courteously, "It's the opening of my master's restaurant today. Firstly, thank you all for coming." After this first line, Manager Chin bowed to the crowd once again before continuing. "My master would like to pass on these words. Gillen Restaurant is one of the old restaurants in this capital after all, so it wouldn't be good if it were to fail in her hands. For today's opening, my master has specially instructed me to treat everyone to a taste of Gillen Restaurant's cooking. If you think it's good, you can draw a lot to win a seat at today's free tasting feast in Gillen Restaurant. My master said this, we're going to make our Gillen Restaurant the best restaurant in this capital, or quit the business entirely." Wow, what a boast. Manager Chin's words had practically drawn all the hatred of the other restaurants. His words had offended all the famous restaurants in the capital at once. Quite a few of the people in the crowd today were the managers and servers of the big restaurants in the capital. Without waiting for those managers and servers to stand out to scold him, some of the ardent supporters of those restaurants had already stepped up. Nonsense. It's obviously Yuehong Restaurant that makes the best food in the capital. What? It's Dian Restaurant's feast that's the best. You're just a nameless little rascal, how dare you talk so wildly. The huge crowd of people had a favorable impression of this scholarly manager at first. However, after his great boast, they only thought that he couldn't tell good from bad and was too cheeky for his own good. In an instant, the sounds of chiding and cursing filled the area below the stage. TL note, sleepy birds return to the forest at dusk, floating clouds return to the mountain when it's clear. This is a pretty Chinese poem incorporating Gillen's name, which means return to the forest. Regarding the managers, servers, and other staff of the restaurant, the modern English terms don't quite match the context of the ancient Chinese restaurant staff, but I tried my best so that we don't have more pinyin terms in the text. Manager runs the restaurant on behalf of an owner/master server, mid-level staff who can wait on tables and settle bills. Runner welcomes customers from the street, waits on tables. Why not waiter? Well, the servers here are doing all sorts of menial labor too, which is not quite related to the term waiter, which makes me think of high-class restaurants. I thought that server might be a more neutral term. Give me your thoughts on this. Customers will also call for the staff by their titles, but it would be weird to hear server. Runner, so this might be replaced by waiter when it appears. W. Chapter 241, Opening. 2. The poor manager Chin was about to be universally condemned by these people. However, Manager Chin still stood up straight on the stage with his hands behind his back. He even carried a faint smile on his face, as if those scoldings couldn't even shake him one bit. He quietly waited for the crowd to release their emotions for a moment before continuing calmly, as the saying goes, if you don't have glue, don't try to fix a broken bowl. You won't know what I can do until you see for yourself. If you don't believe me, why not come up and have a taste? My master and I will be satisfied, no matter your judgment, if you try it at the very least. Oh ho, that young manager was putting out wild boasts again. Fine, I'll make sure this conceited man returns in defeat. The spectators below hadn't thought that Manager Chin would challenge them to judge like this, earning their ire and determination. They all clamored to go up for a taste, wanting to make sure that this lousy Gillen restaurant would have no choice but to admit their loss. They wanted to make this restaurant that hadn't even opened officially turn into the joke of the capital. Manager Chin shot a look at the server behind him. The server brought out 6 strong men, who then moved a pile of crude porcelain dishes to the sides of the stage. Next, the crowd watched as big fat jars as tall as their calves were moved to the center of the stage. Looking at the 3 crudely made jars, someone below started laughing. "Hey, Mr. Manager, your master can't possibly be treating us to some delicacy in those jars, right? Let me guess, don't tell me that it's pickled vegetables in those jars." "Oh my, so Gillen Restaurant's specialty is pickled vegetables. They must be as old as Gillen Restaurant itself." Manager Chin wasn't bothered by the taunts from the crowd below. He simply looked at the 3 jars and waved his hand at the server. The 3 servers standing behind the jars lifted their hands and took off the leather lids from the jars all at once. The autumn wind blew past from behind the stage, causing the fragrant aroma from the jars to drift all around the area. The noses of the people closest to the stage twitched. "What is that smell? Why does it smell so good? I smelled it too. Heavens, what is that?" Steam was rising from the 3 crude jars, shrouding the stage in mist. Suddenly, someone pointed at the 3 ordinary-looking crude earthenware jars. "The smell is coming from those jars." After that person pointed it out, quite a few people started moving closer to the stage, causing the crowd to thicken. "It's really coming from those jars. What is it?" When someone finally asked the question, Manager Chin's smile slowly widened. He patiently explained to the watching crowd, "This is my master's secret recipe of braised pork in pot. It's one of our Gillen Restaurant specialties. We used top-quality pork belly and cooked it in our own secret way. All of you here have good luck. This is the first time this dish is making an appearance in this world. If you want to taste it, you'll have to be quick." Meat. Heavens. So it was actually meat in those jars. It was the first time they had seen someone using jars to cook. Furthermore, this delicious aroma was so rich and appetizing. Was it really just pork in there? How could that base pork smell so heavenly? Impossible. In the current age, very few of the nobles would use pork in their cooking. Most of the meat they ate was comprised of venison or mutton. Pork was meant for the poor commoners who couldn't afford to buy mutton. TL note, here we go, the long-awaited food porn. One of my favorite foods, braised pork. Braised pork in pot with spring onions. Braised pork. Chapter 242, Becoming Famous, 3. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Of course, the standards of cooking in the Great Wu Dynasty went without speaking. Since the food made in a noble house was already that poor, how could the normal commoners fare any better? Normally, pork meat had a certain odor to it. The usage of seasonings in this era wasn't very advanced either. Pork flavored with salt and cooked in water, just the thought of it wasn't very appetizing. The aroma of this carefully braised jar of pork was an immense shock to the crowd. The commoners who had been surrounding the stage and flooding them with curses suddenly had the urge to run up to grab one of the crude porcelain dishes on the stage. There was a waiter stationed behind each of the 3 large jars with a small copper ladle in their hands, shouting and telling the crowd to line up. They dipped the ladles into the jars, giving off fragrant steam, and scooped food into the dish of the first person in line. The copper ladles were just too small. A single scoop would bring up only 2 or 3 small cubes of meat. Another waiter would then sprinkle some finely diced spring onions on top of the meat that had been turned brown by the sauce. For some reason, although it was just some meat sitting in a crude gray porcelain dish, it seemed rather artistic with the green of the spring onions, further increasing their appetite. The old gourmet who had first recognized Gillen Restaurant's brand had finally managed to get a small dish of the braised pork in pot after an arduous wait. He held it up in his hands carefully as he walked away. The small meat cubes in the dish were still steaming hot and trembled with his every step, practically seducing him to eat it all up. The old gourmet squeezed out of the crowd with the dish cradled protectively in his embrace before stopping and taking a long sniff at the aroma of the pork in pot. He sighed as if drunk on the smell. Following that, he took out a pair of silver chopsticks wrapped up in a cloth from his sleeves. Using the chopsticks, he carefully picked up a piece and placed it in his mouth. That delicious taste enveloped his entire mouth. After chewing it precisely 2 times, that thick flavor filled his taste buds. The meat cubes were fresh and tasty, fatty but not greasy. The old gourmet was instantly captivated by the taste of this braised pork in pot. He lost all the patience to carefully judge the remaining 2 pieces and quickly stuffed the remaining pork into his mouth. He chewed on that big mouthful of food and gulped it down. When he looked down at the empty porcelain dish in his hands, the old gourmet's mind instantly turned blank. Those 3 pieces of pork in pot weren't enough by far. He hadn't even been able to savor its flavor before it was all gone. That amount was really way too little. He smacked his lips and suddenly recalled what Manager Chin had said earlier on the stage. Other than this free sample of braised pork, they could draw a lot to win a chance to eat a free feast in Gillen Restaurant. The old gourmet immediately plowed through the crowd to charge back towards the stage with a strength he hadn't even known he had. Even though it seemed like there was a lot of meat in the 3 jars, it wasn't enough to feed all the people in this crowd. Furthermore, even though the jars looked big on the outside, its volume was only half of what it looked like it could contain. All the meat in the jars had been given away in an instant. When his ladle touched the bottom of the jar, the waiter realized that there was only some sauce left. He looked up and spoke apologetically to the young man at the front of the line. "Young man, I'm sorry, we've finished giving out all the free samples for our opening today. If you would like to try out Gillen Restaurant's cooking, then come to the alley in the West Market early in the morning." The young man stared at the waiter in disbelief, his eyes wide open. He refused to believe the waiter and even snatched the jar over to look at the emptiness within for himself. It was only then he pounded his leg in frustration and blamed himself for not queuing up earlier. The other people waiting in the queue had similar reactions after hearing the waiter's announcement. However, like the old gourmet, they recalled Manager Chin's words and fought to be the first to draw a lot from Manager Chin. In an instant, it had become more lively than ever. After eating Gillen Restaurant's braised pork, all the voices of opposition had melted away into nothing. Even though Gillen Restaurant had just newly opened and was even situated in the desolate Old West Market, many of them even immediately turned into Gillen Restaurant's loyal fans. These 3 jars of braised pork in pot were like strong drugs. If you hadn't tasted them, you would be fine. However, after tasting it once, you would only want even more. Those few pieces of meat had drawn everyone's curiosity and appetites out of hiding. Right now, even if Gillen Restaurant was located in the neighboring city of Zhangzhou instead of the out-of-the-way Old West Market, there would still be people who would travel hundreds of miles without fatigue just to have a taste of this heavenly food again. Manager Chin's smile was kind and he faced all the people who came up to draw lots with good humor. However, Dian Restaurant's Mr. Wang, who was not too far away, felt that there was clearly a wily little fox standing behind the friendly facade of this young manager. Furthermore, it wasn't just this Manager Chin who was a wily little fox. That master that he had spoken of must be an even more cunning and even bigger fox. Mr. Wang's horizons had broadened from today's spectacle. He had never seen a restaurant opening like this. He believed that it wouldn't even take a month, no, maybe not even a day, before this newly opened Gillen Restaurant's name would be known all over the capital. He didn't want to admit defeat. The master behind this Gillen Restaurant was quite the schemer. However, he couldn't do anything but accept this hard truth. Gillen Restaurant's food was just way too tasty. Mr. Wang had already experienced much of the world with his years. He also had a noble sponsor backing his restaurant. On New Year's Day and other special days, he could use that connection to have a meal or two in a noble estate. The dishes served in that noble house were already considered heavenly delicacies to most people. However, compared to this completely ordinary-looking pork in pot, those delicacies instantly became some unpalatable rough fare. Mr. Wang sighed. However, his mind wandered back to those measly pieces of braised pork he had just eaten. He really wanted to have a few more bites. He looked down at the wooden tablet in his hands, the lot that he had just drawn. There was even a sense of anticipation within him, hoping that he would be one of the lucky ones. Chapter 243, Becoming Famous. 4. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. The sound of drums rang out from the stage. Manager Chin stood in the center, carrying himself with grace as he read out the numbers of the winning lots. With every number he read out, an excited cheer would cry out from below. Obviously, the person who held the lot with that number was the one cheering. In the end, Dian Restaurant's Mr. Wang wasn't so lucky. However, he wasn't about to admit defeat. He spent 10 whole taels of silver to buy a winning lot from one of the lucky winners. He was going to Gillen Restaurant's feast today, no matter what. The waiter following behind Mr. Wang developed an eye twitch as he watched his manager give away those big silver taels. That was 10 whole taels right there. A whole year of living expenses for his family. Gillen Restaurant had been renovated according to the blueprints that Chu Lian had drawn. Later on, she had also gotten manager Chin to buy the 2 residences on either side of the restaurant. Although Gillen Restaurant's entrance was still the same size, its insides had been changed completely. The rear court had been changed into a 2-part courtyard, complete with its own decorative mountain and long corridors. Although it couldn't be compared to the noble estates of the capital, it still had a certain air of delicate elegance, like the watery regions of Jiangnan. The original 2-part main courtyard had been changed into several small little courts. Each court had its own style of furnishing. Some of them were simple and traditional looking, others were homely and elegant, and there were even some modeled after the Japanese restaurants of the modern world. Basically, each court had its own unique flair. For their customers' convenience, the inner courtyard was reserved for females, while the outer courtyard was used for males. These little courts were made for those with higher status, while the common folk who came here just to eat would be served in the main hall and on the 2nd floor of the main building. Gillen Restaurant had 2 entrances. There was even a hidden entrance in the back after rounding the corner, made for those with special status. The waiters and maidservants serving in the 2-part courtyard at the back were all carefully picked out by manager Chin. They were on a different level from the servers who had been shouting and serving out the free samples on the stage. Seeing as it was almost noon, Chu Lian entered Gillen Restaurant from the back in trance, accompanied by her maidservants. Once she entered the courtyard, manager Chin came over to welcome her. 3rd young madam, Lady Yang and Royal Princess Duanjia have already arrived. They're waiting for you in Earth Court 1. Chu Lian nodded in acknowledgement. She hadn't expected her 2 guests to have come so early. What about the male guests? When he heard Chu Lian's question, manager Chin smiled. Jing'an has already arrived. He's helping to attend to the male guests right now. Old Duke Sheng has also come. Chu Lian raised an eyebrow. She had sent Jing 2 invites. However, she hadn't expected him to give one to old Duke Sheng. When manager Chin saw that Chu Lian's expression had changed slightly, he paused before adding on, Miss Mingyan has also come over with old Duke Sheng. Chu Lian glanced at manager Chin, but didn't reply to him outright. She only said, have someone keep an eye on the situation. Make sure that the people who won the lucky draw are treated well, too. We can't have anything going wrong today. 3rd young madam, please rest assured. This subordinate will send some people to keep an eye on everything. After she finished instructing manager Chin, she led Wenqing and Wenlan with her to meet Royal Princess Duanjia and Lady Yang. At this time, 2 carriages arrived at the entrance of the alley of the Old West Market, accompanied by a few retainers following alongside them. Even from afar, there were already commoners gawking at this expensive-looking carriage. Some ignorant children were even following the carriage from behind and running along with it. After getting shouted at by 2 burly-looking retainers on horseback, the children ran off in fright. The curtains at the front of the carriage were pulled aside from the inside. Miss Yuan rolled her eyes after taking a peek. What kind of terrible place is this? Sixth sister must have gone mad, opening a restaurant in a place like this. The lady sitting opposite her, Miss Sue, glared at her. If you have nothing good to say, then don't speak at all. Miss Yuan harumphed in contempt, you're just saying so for appearances. I bet you're feeling the same way in your heart, maybe even more than I am. What are you playing the good guy for? Miss Fu smiled as she watched from the side. Miss Sue's face flushed red. However, she didn't have anything to say as a retort. She was indeed thinking the same thing inwardly. Opening a restaurant out here in this desolate residential area, would any customers really come all the way out here? Even she, as a young miss who didn't know much about business, understood this logic. Could Chu Lien really be that stupid? When Miss Yuan saw that Miss Sue was tongue-tied and red from frustration, she felt completely refreshed. Miss Yuan was filled with disdain. It was just a small restaurant, that bitch Chu Lien even sent an invite over. She hadn't wanted to come at first, but after thinking it over, she sent someone to hear more about the situation, only to find that the restaurant was actually located in such an out-of-the-way area. Of course, she suddenly found the interest to come after that. She wanted to see how Sixth sister was going to lose face. She still carried the grudge from that incident with the hairpin. TL note, some pictures to help you imagine what the restaurant might look like. Entrance center of courtyard with open roof, ancient Chinese restaurant interior, grander looking inner main hall for the courtyards mentioned in this chapter. Its layout might look something like this: 1 part courtyard, 2 part courtyard. Chapter 244, Becoming Famous, 5. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. It was exactly because of that grudge that Miss Yuan pestered second madam until she agreed to let her attend the restaurant's opening together with the other young ladies of their family. Madame Rong had intended to come along as well, but an unexpected incident held her back. As the lady in charge of the Ying estate, her top priority was the estate's affairs. Thus, when Madame Rong personally escorted the 3 ladies to the estate's entrance, she instructed the eldest amongst them, Miss Sue, to take care of her younger sisters in her stead before sending off their carriage. The 3 sisters had arrived late. By 12 p.m., all the manservants and maidservants in charge of welcome the guests had already returned to the restaurant, and even Chu Lien thought it was unlikely House Ying would send any representatives since it was so far past the greeting time. Without any escort at all, House Ying's carriage went straight to Gillen Restaurant's main entrance. Before they got off the carriage, one of the retainers outside leaned in close to the carriage, lowered his voice, and reported, "Mrs. Gillen Restaurant's entrance has been blocked." The disdain on Miss Yuan's face was wiped clean. She lifted the curtains and looked towards Gillen Restaurant's plain-looking entrance. The entrance of Gillen Restaurant was swarming with people. There was even a long queue outside, filling the already narrow alley. How could this be possible? How could a restaurant in such a desolate area have this many customers? Miss Sue also found it strange. She instructed the retainer to ask around Gillen Restaurant's main entrance. In a moment's time, that retainer returned. He carried a doubtful and baffled expression as he reported, replying to Fifth Miss, "All these people are here to eat at Gillen Restaurant." What? Miss Yuan couldn't hold back her shout. Her sudden fuss over something so trivial earned her a glare from Miss Sue. Miss Sue paused for a while before taking out 2 fine invitations from her sleeve and passing them to the retainer. Give these 2 invitations to Gillen Restaurant's manager. Tell him that we're here to meet honored Lady Jeannie." The retainer acknowledged the order and left. Not too long later, the retainer led Manager Chin and a wise-looking senior servant over to the carriage. Manager Chin personally ordered someone to bring House Ying's carriage over to the rear entrance. Once they entered the inner court meant for female guests, senior servant Zhong took over and led them to a small court within. Senior servant Zhong instructed the maidservant standing by in the courtyard to attend to House Ying's ladies and invited them to sit down. After doing so, she then stood by the side and respectfully said, "Mrs., please wait a moment. Our 3rd young madam will be arriving shortly." Miss Fu cast a measuring gaze over senior servant Zhong. Her eyes flickered, but she didn't speak in the end. Miss Su thanked senior servant Zhong. Meanwhile, Miss Yuan sked in disapproval. "What? We're guests today. Is 6th sister really going to make us wait?" Miss Su frowned. Senior servant Zhong, on the other hand, stiffened and pressed her lips together before uttering an apology. "You're our 3rd young madam's esteemed guests. It's this old servant's fault for not inviting 3rd young madam over earlier." Miss Yuan's expression changed and she glared at senior servant Zhong. She hadn't expected this old servant to be so tactless. She was actually trying to protect Chu Lian, even at this time. Despite being just a lowly menial servant, she actually dared to retort to her. Miss Yuan was used to getting her way in the Ying estate. She was about to scold senior servant Zhong on the spot. However, before she could say another word, she was held back by Miss Su and Miss Fu. Even Miss Fu, who usually liked to sit back and watch the sparks fly, had tried to hold her back today. She immediately turned to Miss Fu with a glare. However, senior servant Zhong wasn't at all flustered by Miss Yuan's temper. She bobbed towards the 3 young ladies and continued as if nothing had happened. "This old servant will personally prepare some tea and snacks for the young misses. Please make yourself at home." Miss Yuan stared as senior servant Zhong walked right out of the courtyard. Then, she turned to her sisters with a face flushed red from frustration. "5th sister, 9th sister, look at that. Is that how 6th sister treats her guests? Why didn't you let me scold her?" Miss Su and Miss Fu weren't stupid. They weren't going to agree with Miss Yuan's blame towards Chu Lian. Miss Su furrowed her brows and put on a stern expression. "7th sister, that's enough from you. This isn't House Ying's 2nd branch. Don't take things too far." Miss Fu sneered. "That's right, don't throw our dignity out together with yours." Miss Yuan had been in a bad mood ever since entering Gillen Restaurant and seeing the novel arrangements within the building. And now adding on to that, her 2 sisters were even scolding her. Her face turned red with anger. However, there was no one here to back her up. Furthermore, ever since that incident at Jinshi Pavilion, she had learned to behave a little more. She wrung her handkerchief and managed to resist the urge to retort again. However, she had come here to see Chu Lian make a joke out of herself. How could Miss Yuan let her go so easily? She shot a glance at one of her handmaids, who then quickly brought out a container of food from behind her. In a moment, one of Gillen Restaurant's maidservants brought in freshly brewed tea. Steam billowed up from the cups, carrying a specially dry, bitter smell. Although housing was in decline, a starving camel was still larger than a horse. They had been carefully raised from a young age, so they could recognize that this was a loose-leaf tea from North Fujian. Although Xincha brewing was now trending in the Great Wu dynasty, there were many different types of tea, separated by the region they came from. North Fujian loose-leaf tea was one of the main branches of tea. Loose-leaf tea fell into 2 categories, normal and high quality. However, if you weren't a tea enthusiast, it wasn't so easy to discern their quality. The 3 ladies of House Ying could only distinguish what type of Xincha this was. However, they couldn't really tell much else about it. If it had been the former, Chu Lian though, she might have been able to discern its quality. Miss Yuan sniffed and rolled her eyes. Six sisters already opened a restaurant, how could she be so miserly as to serve her sisters this kind of tea? The maidservant who had brought in the tea was so embarrassed that her cheeks flushed red. She looked downwards, not daring to reply. When Miss Yuan noticed the maidservant's fingers trembling, she felt a little better. She turned to her handmaid and ordered, "Brew some tea for me." Her handmaid had a smug expression as she slowly brought out a fine porcelain container. She then purposely placed the porcelain container in front of Miss Su and Miss Fu to show it off a little. Chapter 245, Becoming Famous, 6. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Miss Su frowned. She could tell that this was a container of Jingshan tea, one of the best quality Sincha teas around. Every year, old Duke Ying would only be able to get 2 containers of this fine tea. Last year, old Duchess Ying had bestowed one of them to the second branch. She hadn't expected that this tea had somehow landed in Miss Yuan's hands. How could Miss Su know of the reason behind this? Miss Yuan was so determined to disgrace Chu Lian today that she had prepared a lot more than just some fine tea. Furthermore, she hadn't pleaded with her parents to get this tea, she had just stolen it directly out of her father's study. Miss Fu was shocked, but chose to remain quiet as she only pressed her lips together and watched on. Miss Yuan, Miss Su was about to say something, but was interrupted by Miss Yuan before she could continue. What's wrong, fifth sister? Look at how poorly they're treating their guests. Why can't I bring my own tea to drink? How was this poor treatment? It was clearly Miss Yuan who was picking at the most trivial matters and making a mountain out of an anthill. The handmaid turned to Gillen Restaurant's maidservants to request for some tea brewing tools. However, another handmaid opened up the box of food. Without waiting for senior servant Zhong to come back with snacks, the second handmaid carefully brought out plate after plate of exquisite snacks and placed them on the table. This time, even Miss Fu had joined Miss Su in staring at Miss Yuan with a strange look in her eyes. They could tell that these snacks had come from Dan Restaurant. What's more, the plates had lotus flower patterns, so this was clearly the best assortment of snacks in the whole capital, as established by high-class society. Of course, it wasn't cheap. A small box of this assortment cost more than 10 taels. As young ladies of housing, their monthly allowances didn't even hit 10 taels. This time, Miss Yuan had really given an arm and a leg for her little ploy. Despite her sister's weird looks, the corners of Miss Yuan's lips lifted into a smile instead. What are you doing, blanking out like that? Come and eat some. I got these snacks from Dan Restaurant. We don't get to eat these often in the estate. Miss Su's expression turned even sterner. To Miss Yuan, she warned, "Seventh sister, remember that we're here to give our congratulations and not for other motives." Miss Yuan reached out and picked up a piece of osmanthus cake. What are you thinking about, fifth sister? I haven't done anything at all, have I? Chu Lian was currently attending to Lady Yang and Royal Princess Duanjia in Earth Court 1 when a servant sent by Manager Qin came to report that her sisters from House Xing had arrived. When Royal Princess Duanjia heard the report, she immediately rolled her eyes. What have they come here for? Chu Lian smiled but didn't reply. She knew that Royal Princess Duanjia didn't like the ladies of House Xing. Lady Yang also wasn't someone who liked pandering to social niceties, so instead of bringing either of them with her, Chu Lian asked Royal Princess Duanjia to continue chatting with Lady Yang while she went over to attend to the ladies from her maiden house. While on her way, she met Senior Servant Zhong. Senior Servant Zhong hesitated for an instant, but she still reported the current situation in the courtyard to Chu Lian. Chu Lian looked at the maidservants carrying boxes of snacks behind senior servant Zhong and smiled. Although they could care less, we can't be remiss with our manners. Momo, send the snacks in anyway. Although senior servant Zhong looked down upon the ladies of housing thanks to their behavior, since Chu Lian had given the order, she couldn't disobey. She bobbed in acknowledgement and followed after Chu Lian, leading the two maidservants along with her. When Chu Lian noticed this, she was satisfied. Although He Sanlang had left these three servants to watch her, they were all useful to her in their own ways. The moment Chu Lian entered the courtyard, one of the maidservants announced her arrival. She entered the parlor of the little court and saw that her sisters had stood up to welcome her. However, only Miss Yuan had purposely stood further back to show off the items on the table. Chu Lian took one glance at the table and inwardly sneered. She just knew that this Miss Yuan would be up to no good. If not for the sake of maintaining peace between the two houses tied by marriage, she really wouldn't have sent any invitations at all to Housing. Without waiting for Miss Su to speak, Miss Yuan had already started talking, her words dripping with sarcasm. Sixth sister must be really busy today. Even your own sisters have been cast off to one side. I wonder which esteemed guest sixth sister was attending to just now. Why didn't you introduce them to us so that we can make their acquaintance? The ladies here had heard a little about the friendship between Chu Lian and Prince Wei's estate. In Miss Yuan's eyes, Chu Lian had gotten her honored lady title thanks to her friendship with Royal Princess Duanjia. How could she not be jealous? Before Chu Lian had gotten married, she had been someone that Miss Yuan could bully any time she wanted. However, right after marrying into House Jingyan, Chu Lian's fortunes had suddenly changed. Seeing her getting along so well in life only made Miss Yuan grit her teeth in anger. Chu Lian gestured for her sisters to sit before addressing them with a warm smile. I was accompanying Lady Yang and Royal Princess Duanjia earlier, so please pardon me for neglecting fifth sister, seventh sister, and ninth sister. However, Lady Yang doesn't like to interact with strangers, so I'm afraid I can't help with seventh sister's request. Throughout Chu Lian's entire address, Miss Yuan's expression had steadily turned even darker. She hadn't thought that Chu Lian would reject her so directly. However, she couldn't just force her to bring her to meet Lady Yang and Royal Princess Duanjia. Thus, Miss Yuan could only do her best to exercise her self-restraint. She cast her eyes down, and upon seeing the snacks on the table, she harumphed coldly in her heart and an evil smile surfaced on her lips. Chapter 246, Becoming Famous, 7. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore Novels. Please read from the original source. Even though Chu Lian wasn't too fond of this half-sister of hers, it was the grand opening of her restaurant today, so she couldn't really leave Miss Yuan hanging. She reached out and tugged at Miss Su's sleeve with a smile as she said, "It's about time now. Fifth sister, seventh sister, ninth sister, the kitchen will send our meal over soon." Miss Su quickly shot a glance at the table behind them before looking at Chu Lian again. When she noticed that Chu Lian's expression was calm, she inwardly heaved a sigh of relief before leading Chu Lian down to sit by the table. As much as Miss Su and Miss Fu wanted to avoid creating any awkward situations, with Miss Yuan around, how could that be possible? Miss Yuan sent another look at her handmaid. The handmaid then brought over a tray with the freshly brewed tea with an arrogant swagger to her walk. She kept her haughty expression even as she set a teacup in front of each of the ladies at the table. Miss Yuan picked up the white porcelain teacup and lifted it to her nose. After a short sniff, she acted as if she was drunk on the smell of the tea. She then smiled and boastfully said, "Sixth sister, I usually drink this Xingshan tea at home, thanks to grandfather and grandmother's love for me. After getting used to it, I just can't drink any of this North Fujian loose-leaf tea of yours. I'm sure sixth sister has never had a chance to taste this Xingshan tea before." Why don't you try some? Chu Lian stared at Miss Yuan with her big, bright eyes that seemed like they could see through everyone's hearts. Miss Yuan didn't dare to meet that gaze and hurriedly looked away. Even though she should have been pleased with herself, there was a mysterious sense of guilt in her heart. Miss Su and Miss Fu stiffened in surprise and turned to Chu Lian with peculiar expressions. Chu Lian innocently blinked. Thank you for the offer, seventh sister, but unfortunately, I don't like Sincha anymore. She had absolutely zero interest towards Sincha. Forget Jingshan, even if it was the highest grade of tea straight from the imperial tribute itself, Chu Lian still wouldn't be interested. Seventh Miss Chu Yuan could slowly savor her precious Jingshan tea by herself. Chu Lian's answer was completely out of Miss Yuan's expectations. She stared at Chu Lian with wide eyes, her true emotions completely revealed on her face despite her best efforts to hide them. How could that be? Back in the Ying estate, Chu Lian had taken utmost pride in her sencha brewing skill. Even old Duke Ying had praised her for it once. At every special occasion or family banquet, she would always offer to brew some sencha to show off her skills and earn the favor of the older members in their family. However, despite her skill in tea ceremony, she still wasn't able to get any high-quality tea in her hands. Miss Yuan always mocked her for that, even purposely wasting precious high-quality tea right in front of her eyes. Today, she had gotten this Jingshan tea specifically to provoke her. How could Chu Lian say that she didn't like Sincha anymore? How could someone who had previously been so in love with Sincha suddenly change her mind? Was that even possible? All sorts of thoughts ran through Miss Yuan's head for a while before she finally managed to calm down. She found the perfect excuse for herself and decided that Chu Lian was just hiding her real emotions. She was probably going mad with envy and jealousy inside, and only acting as if nothing was wrong on the surface. Saying that she didn't want to drink the tea was just to avoid feeling sad over it. She had already figured out exactly what that Chu Lian was thinking. Since sixth sister doesn't like it, then the three of us will drink it together. After saying so, she took a sip right in front of Chu Lian, and even purposely started telling Miss Fu how sweet and aromatic the tea was and how it contained all sorts of flavors. If Chu Lian knew that Miss Yuan's abnormal behavior was meant to provoke her, she would have rolled her eyes directly at Miss Yuan. Since she was so good at jumping to conclusions, why didn't she just jump straight up to heaven? Conversely, Miss Su was the one who looked at Chu Lian with worry. Sixth sister, you used to love Sincha so much. Why don't you like it anymore? Chu Lian reassured her with a smile. I'm not sure why, but I just lost all liking for it. Now I prefer to drink honey water or fruit teas. Perhaps our taste buds just change with time. When Miss Su heard her explanation, she got lost a little in her thoughts. When she thought of how different Chu Lian's life had turned after marrying into House Jingyan, she didn't know whether she felt more sympathy or happiness for Chu Lian. Sixth sister said it well. You'll be happy as long as you follow your heart. Miss Yuan glanced at them from the corner of her eyes. Her mind was filled with hatred as she thought, keep acting, just keep acting. I want to see how long Chu Lian can keep acting for. Chu Lian didn't have any energy to waste on guessing Miss Yuan's thoughts. There was so much on her plate. There was no need to bother with a small fry like Miss Yuan who only knew how to jump up and down in a temper. She wasn't the original Chu Lian, so Miss Yuan was just a stranger to her. As long as Miss Yuan didn't go overboard, she wouldn't use any of her limited time and energy to deal with her. She wasn't the original Chu Lian anymore and she didn't share any of her past likes. If she suddenly changed all at once, it might draw unnecessary attention, so why not remind her maiden family bit by bit that she was slowly starting to change? She was no longer that Chu Lian who stayed hidden in the Ying estate. Telling them that she no longer liked Sincha was just the start. She believed that Miss Sue would remember her words. As long as Miss Sue knew this, Madame Roan would naturally find out about it as well, and if Madame Roan knew, then so did the entire estate. Chapter 247, Becoming Famous, 8. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. When Miss Yuan saw that Miss Sue was chatting happily with Chu Lian, her hands curled into fists. She took in a deep breath and purposely picked up one of the white square snacks on the table. With a voice a little louder than usual, she then said, "This white snow cake from Din restaurant matches this Xingshan so well. I heard grandmother say that Din restaurant's confections are just as good as the ones in the palace." She then looked over to Chu Lian. Chu Lian waved over the maidservants behind her who were still carrying the boxes of snacks. "Fifth sister, seventh sister, ninth sister, would you like to try the confections from my Gillen restaurant?" Without waiting for Miss Sue to reply, Miss Yuan cut in again, harumphing. "Sixth sister, aren't you overestimating yourself? You've just opened this restaurant and you don't have any secret recipes. How could your confections be better than Din restaurants? Even if you make them look pretty, that's just deceiving people. Sixth sister, you should just pack these up so you don't dirty other people's eyes." Miss Yuan had gone overboard with her words. These were just some confections, how could they possibly dirty people's eyes? Miss Sue shot a fierce glare towards Miss Yuan and quickly made to reassure Chu Lian. "Sixth sister, don't listen to her nonsense. Her personality has always been like this ever since she was little, and I'm sure you know that too. Don't take her words to heart. Bring out your confections, I want to try them." Chu Lian smiled at Miss Sue first before looking at Miss Yuan. "If you don't like my confections, then you don't have to eat them, seventh sister." I wouldn't eat them even if you gave them to me. Let me tell you, I couldn't care less about your snacks, and I'm not going to eat a single bit of the banquet later." Mrs. Sue and Fu were already stunned. Who could have expected the two ladies from the second branch to start fighting right in front of them? Chu Lian tilted her head as she looked at Miss Yuan without much change in expression. She only said, "Seventh sister is a guest here at my Gillen restaurant. Of course seventh sister is free to do as she likes." After saying so, without a second look at Miss Yuan, she turned to instruct the maidservants on arranging the trays of snacks on the table. Multicolored round little sponge cakes, steamed vermicelli rolls, osmanthus chestnut biscuits, specially made heart-shaped jujube paste cakes. Various types of snacks were placed in porcelain dishes of a variety of different shapes. They looked like miniature art pieces meant for only for admiring, not to be touched, let alone to be eaten. Each of the confections were made to be about the size of a quail egg, just about enough for 2 bites, and each tray contained just 3 or 4 pieces. That was just enough for them to have something to snack on with the tea and still have room to enjoy the banquet later on. A light fragrance drifted up from the exquisite, elegant pastries. They were placed right next to the ones from Din restaurant. As long as you don't compare things, there's no harm done. Din restaurant's confections looked quite beautiful until they were set right next to Gillen restaurant's. They seemed like fine delicacies at first, but now they seemed like a poor man's fare. The contrast was too great to ignore. As blind as Miss Yuan was, she could also tell that Din restaurant's confections just couldn't be compared to Gillen restaurant's. Miss Fu let out a gasp of shock. "Sixth sister, these confections are so beautiful. Have a taste." After they placed the round sponge cakes into their mouths, they could feel the soft and sticky texture of the cake as its unique aroma enveloped their tongues. It wasn't too sweet and even carried a slight bitterness, almost like tea. Miss Sue and Miss Fu's eyes widened in surprise. Even the normally steady Miss Sue's face had a mixed expression of shock and enjoyment. Although Miss Fu carried hidden motives, she was still a young girl. When she found something she liked, she wouldn't conceal her happiness. Sixth sister, what is this one called? It's so tasty. Chu Lian pointed at each of the confections and gave a simple introduction of each one. Miss Yuan stared at Miss Su and Miss Fu in disbelief. She ground her teeth in frustration as her gaze landed upon the confections on the table. Although she was about to explode from the pent-up emotions in her heart, saliva pooled in her mouth. If not for those words she had said earlier, she would already have grabbed a piece to try for herself and see exactly how tasty these confections were. Hidden under her broad sleeves, Miss Yuan's right hand gathered into a fist. The satisfied expressions of Miss Su and Miss Fu as they ate the confections had become the greatest ridicule to her. She reached out with one hand, seemingly headed towards the tray of Gillen Restaurant's confections, but she turned and picked up a confection from Din Restaurant's tray instead. When she placed the white snow cake in her mouth, she could no longer taste the same feeling of sweetness and satisfaction. Chu Lian noticed all of her actions, but didn't say anything. This was what Chu Yuan decided for herself, and she couldn't blame anyone else. Furthermore, the only consequence was that Chu Yuan wouldn't be able to eat anything from her Gillen restaurant. That couldn't be counted as any sort of punishment. After 15 minutes, the trays of confections were cleared away by the maidservants. Out of sight, out of mind. Miss Yuan's stiff expression loosened a little. However, before she could take a moment's respite, Chu Lian had already ordered senior servant Zhong to bring in the banquet. It was then that Chu Yuan realized her torture had just begun, thanks to her presumptuous actions. Chu Lian couldn't continue accompanying her sisters from housing alone, since she still had to attend to Lady Yang and Royal Princess Duanjia. She also had to check in with the male guests in the outer court, since she was the real owner of Gillen Restaurant. Miss Yuan still had some integrity in her. Right after Chu Lian left, she took the chance to escape and immediately left Gillen Restaurant. Miss Su and Miss Fu couldn't let her leave alone, so they notified senior servant Zhong. Leaving behind their apologies and gifts, they followed Miss Yuan back to the inn estate. Miss Yuan had lost her bait along with the fish today. She had come to pick at Chu Lian, only to slap herself in the face and become a sorry sight. Chapter 248, You Don't Have to Come Back Anymore. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Later that day, when Miss Yuan returned to the inn estate, second master Chu Qijing found out that she had stolen his tea. The two of them started a fight and ended up bearing a grudge against each other. When Chu Lian found out about this much later on, she merely acted like someone had told her a good joke. Back at Gillen Restaurant, in the outer court meant for male guests, a group of nobles of various ages were sitting together at a table. The eldest there was old Duke Xing, while the youngest was the young Marquis Wei Yuan. These people wouldn't normally mingle, but had been brought together today thanks to Chu Lian's amazing food. All of them chose to simply enjoy the delicacies before them and avoid bringing up any topic related to politics. After half a month of rest and eating the food carefully made by Ming Yan, old Duke Xing was now hale and hearty like before. There was even a healthy flush on his nose, and he seemed full of energy. Old Duke Xing had recently fallen in love with spicy poached fish. He would order it for every meal back at the Xing estate. The snow-white fish slices looked even more fresh and tender when floating in a pool of spicy red chili oil. They looked so soft that they might even make him swallow his tongue by accident. He had thought that poached fish slices were the highest level of gourmet food. However, it was only today at Gillen Restaurant that he discovered how wrong he was. When a manservant came in and placed a plate of grilled fish on the table, old Duke Sheng's eyes almost popped out from surprise. Gillen Restaurant used the most tender freshwater fish from the Min River to make this spicy grilled fish dish. The specially selected freshwater fish had to be at their freshest when killed. The fish's flesh had to remain soft and tender when cooked, while the outer layer of skin had to be grilled to a crispy brown. The natural oiliness was wrung out before grilling, so afterwards, all that was left was the soft, slippery flesh and the crispy fish skin. Then before eating, one could dip the grilled slices into the accompanying chili sauce. After swallowing that down, they couldn't resist taking bite after bite after bite. Their chopsticks couldn't stop grabbing more fish and placing it in their mouths until the tip of their tongues turned numb. However, that only enhanced their enjoyment of this delicacy. In addition to the fish was also a few side dishes, like fresh bean sprouts, lettuce, roasted chestnuts, and other bright green leafy vegetables. These ordinary vegetables were cooked using the juices from the fish, so they had a different, addictive taste than what they were used to. All the men seated in the parlor had completely forgotten to make small talk while gorging on the delicious food before them. When they finally set their chopsticks down, their noses had long since turned runny. Seeing this, the manservants behind them passed over some wet towels for them. Old Duke Xing wiped away his snot in satisfaction. It was already autumn, but thanks to the spicy food they had just eaten, there was a fine layer of sweat on their foreheads. Even though this was a rather wretched appearance for a noble man, old Duke Xing still gave a shout of "amazing" in compliment of the food. This made the manservants behind them sweat from embarrassment. Marquis Wei Yuan's taste buds tended more towards light flavors. He couldn't really take spicy food. However, when he saw everyone's chopsticks reaching out for that steaming hot plate of grilled fish, he couldn't resist the temptation. He swallowed his saliva before reaching towards that square plate as well. After eating 2 slices of grilled fish, Marquis Wei Yuan was almost tearing up from the spiciness. His originally pink lips had also turned red and swollen, almost on the verge of turning into mini sausages. While rubbing at his lips with one hand, he still couldn't help picking up more fish with the other. He had totally lost his usually noble, handsome bearing. Right now, he was just a greedy foodie with a voracious appetite without any care for his image. The heads of the manservants sunk even lower. Each of them tried their best to sink into the floor in shame. Were these men really nobles? Look at the way they were fighting for food. Ming Yan had also followed old Duke Xing to Gillen restaurant today. She wasn't actually allowed to be in the parlor with the nobles, so she hid behind a screen and peeked in. The manservants in this parlor had all been personally chosen by Manager Qin for their quick wits. Old Duke Xing had only brought a single maidservant today, so it was obvious that she wasn't just a normal maidservant. Thus, they simply closed one eye towards her peeping. Anyway, she was just watching from behind a screen and wasn't doing anything overboard. Ming Yan's face had turned pale while she was watching the nobles eat. When her gaze landed on the large dining table in the middle of the parlor, she suddenly realized that she had never seen a single one of the dishes on the table before. Ming Yan's heart sank. What was this? How had third young madam come up with so many new dishes? Could it be that she had even more secret recipes in hand? Lost in her shock, Ming Yan leaned on one of the carved flowers on the screen's frame, almost causing it to fall over due to her weight. Luckily, a manservant standing nearby noticed it in time and quickly caught the screen. The manservant then unhappily said, "Excuse me, miss. If you're not needed here, please leave this parlor. If there's an accident, we won't be able to make up for it even with our lives." Ming Yan finally recovered her senses and rationality. She hurriedly thanked the manservant and then stumbled her way out of the parlor with her thoughts in a mess. TL note: I can't take spicy foods like Marquis Wei Yuan, so the sight of all these chilis is scary to me. TVT grilled fish in chili. Another grilled fish. The term the author used for the fish is very generic, so I can't tell what the exact type of fish it is that they're eating. It generally refers to any type of fish raised in a very pure river with clear waters. Chapter 249, You Don't Have to Come Back Anymore, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Could it be that third young madam had hidden most of her secret recipes from them when she was back at Santal Court? No, that was impossible. Third young madam never evaded them whenever she cooked. She even personally taught them her secret recipes. She wasn't silly, so she had earnestly remembered and picked up whatever third young madam had taught them. Third young madam was just a normal person. How could she have an endless store of secret recipes? Even if she had more than a few of them, after all this time, Ming Yan should have finished learning all of them. Why were there suddenly even more dishes that she hadn't ever seen before? Actually, Ming Yan had only learned about 20 or so dishes. That number was just a drop in the ocean for the great foodie Chu Lian, who had eaten most of the foods on either side of the Yangtze River. It was only Ming Yan herself who had thought that she had learned all of the secret recipes that third young madam's family had passed down. Judging from the scene just now, Gillen Restaurant's dishes had clearly stolen away old Duke Zhang's favor. How was she going to gain a foothold in the Zhang estate by old Duke Zhang's side now? As she continued to think, Ming Yan's mood worsened. She wasn't satisfied. She had already bravely taken the first step away from Chu Lian. She definitely wasn't going to return. She paced about in the corridor outside the parlor, the handkerchief in her hands already wrung into knots. Finally, she made a decision and quickly strode out of the courtyard. She asked directions from a manservant before moving quickly towards the kitchen. However, before she could enter, she was blocked by a tall server guarding the kitchen. "Miss, please stop there. Outsiders are not allowed in Gillen Restaurant's kitchen." Ming Yan lowered her head and trembled imperceptibly. In the next moment, she had already made up her mind. Ming Yan raised her head and met the server's sharp gaze. Then, she declared, "I'm third young madam's handmaid and I've come here under her orders to handle some affairs in the kitchen. How dare you stop me?" The originally confident server froze for a moment and was at a loss for what to do when a familiar voice sounded from behind Ming Yan. "Ah Zhong, go inside and help. Leave this to me." The speaker was Xian. Xian often came to Gillen Restaurant to teach the cooks new dishes, so the staff here were all familiar with her. The server called Ah Zhong immediately saluted to Xian before entering the kitchen. Ming Yan's body was rooted to the spot. She hadn't expected Xian to come to the kitchen at this time. However, her next thought calmed her down. She wasn't doing anything against her conscience here. Furthermore, while serving old Duke Xing, he didn't treat her as a maidservant at all. Even if she claimed to be old Duke Sheng's granddaughter, others might believe it. Her current status was higher than Xian's, so she could hold her head high and keep her back straight. "Miss Ming Yan, you've been taking care of His Grace all this time. How could I not have noticed when third young madam sent you some orders?" Xian mocked. This Ming Yan seemed honest enough before when they still spent day after day working beside one another. Who could have thought that she would have such a disloyal heart? She even tried to fake third young madam's orders. If she really entered the kitchen, who knew what kind of disaster might occur? Today was Gillen Restaurant's first banquet. It was an extremely important day, and there was no room for mistakes. Ming Yan could sense Xian's distance in her tone. She frowned and scolded Xian in her heart. However, she still forced a smile on her face. She walked over to Xian's side and said, "Sister Xian, you've mistaken me. I just noticed that the dishes that Gillen Restaurant brought out today were all new, so I wanted to come over and broaden my horizons a little. I didn't have any other intentions." Xian tugged her arm away from Ming Yan's hold and looked at her with a cold expression. "You had better not have any other intentions. If there's nothing, you should go back to His Grace's side. Gillen Restaurant's dishes are all made from secret recipes, so the kitchen isn't a place for outsiders to enter." There was no courtesy left in Xian's very direct words. She wasn't someone who liked to beat around the bush anyway. Furthermore, this Ming Yan was annoying, so Shi Yan just spoke however she liked. Ming Yan couldn't hold the smile on her face any longer. She stomped her foot in rage. Sister Shi Yan, what do you mean by that? You're treating me as an outsider. Even when third young madam was cooking back in the estate, she never minded letting me watch. That was because you were still third young madam's handmaid back then. You were someone who served third young madam. However, your current master is Duke Sheng. Only whenever you start serving third young madam again is when everything will be as before. After throwing down these words, Shi Yan couldn't be bothered to continue talking to this ingrate. She quickly turned and entered the kitchen, leaving just the sight of her back for Ming Yan. Ming Yan glared at the kitchen door for a long moment. However, in the end, she could only spit at the door and stomp her foot once more before leaving. Following that, Ming Yan tried searching for Jing Yan and Fu Yan. However, they were currently serving by Chu Lian's side, so she wasn't able to meet them. With an uneasy and impatient heart, Ming Yan returned to wait outside the parlor with tumultuous feelings. Right as she reached the entrance of the parlor, she could hear old Duke Sheng's booming voice from within. After a moment of hesitation, she walked forward and came even closer to the parlor. Jeannie, it's good that you opened this restaurant. This old man will have a place to eat from now on. That was old Duke Sheng's voice, brimming full of undisguised joy. Then Gillen Restaurant will be depending on old Duke Sheng from now on. Chu Lian's voice was uniquely gentle and bright, very pleasing to the ear. Oh yes, these few days, I've been recovering well, all thanks to the maidservant you left in my estate. Her skills aren't bad at all. However, my body's almost fully recovered and I can't keep your personal handmaid away from you. Why don't you send someone to take her back today? Chu Lian blinked and smiled. It seems like Ming Yan has gotten your grace's favor. This junior has enough servants. Since your grace likes her skills, there's no need to send her back. This junior will send that girl's contract over to the estate some other day. That girl has learned quite a few of my secret recipes after all. Your grace, you have to accept this present from your humble junior. Chapter 250. Aftermath of Becoming Famous. 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. What? Third young madam wanted to give her away to the Jing estate. Ming Yan's eyes almost popped out in shock and disbelief. Taking the initiative to abandon someone and getting abandoned were completely different matters. Old Duke Sheng looked at Chu Lian with a thought-provoking expression. He had been involved in politics for many years, so he could see the real reason behind Chu Lian's actions without much effort. He thought that Chu Lian would feel awkward or ashamed under his stare, but unexpectedly, there wasn't even the slightest hint of a blush on her face. Her eyes remained bright and clear, even reflecting some degree of amusement. When their gazes met, it was he who felt uneasy first. After freezing for a moment, old Duke Sheng burst out into laughter. Fine. Since it's a token of Jeannie's regard, this old man will accept it. Chu Lian bobbed slightly towards old Duke Sheng. Ming Yan is blessed to be able to take care of your grace. All right, child. There's no need for all those wishy-washy pleasantries at my age. If that girl serves me sincerely, then I'll treat her fairly. Now, Jeannie, you'll have to leave a small court for me here at your new restaurant. Chu Lian smiled and agreed to it with a nod. Marquis Wei Yuan wanted to ask Chu Lian for a court here as well, but unfortunately, with old Duke Sheng sitting at the same table, he didn't dare to speak up. He could only scratch his ear and wait for a chance to ask He Daoang later instead. While the people inside the parlor were chatting away warmly, Ming Yan was slowly freezing over outside. She was really going to be one of the servants of the Jing estate from now on. When she thought back to the past few months at Songtao Court, they didn't seem real now. Ming Yan pressed her lips together and raised her head. The glint in her eyes shone with resolution. This was the road she had chosen for herself, and there was no longer any space to retreat. Compared to living in that small courtyard back in the Jingyan estate and serving a living widow, why not try her luck in the Jing estate? She still had third young madam's secret recipes anyway. Once she gained a foothold in the Jing estate, she would be able to stand up straight in front of third young madam in the future. She was going to make sure that third young madam regretted abandoning her today. A trace of hatred flashed across Ming Yan's eyes. After getting rid of a burden, Chu Lian felt refreshed. She returned to Earth Court 1 accompanied by Wenqing and Wenlan. The days of an empty main hall and deserted entrance were gone. A huge crowd was gathered outside Gillen Restaurant's plain entrance, drawing a striking comparison with the past. If not for the servers constantly reassuring the crowd outside, the customers would all have charged into the restaurant by now. The 30 lucky customers who had drawn the winning lots had already been ushered in and given seats. The servers were shouting in a lively manner as they passed back and forth between the tables and served up food. 4 cold dishes and 8 hot ones, together with 1 soup, were all placed on the tables in just a few moments. There were 13 dishes representing the 13 great guardians for an auspicious opening. This was the first time most of the common folk had seen such a luxurious spread for a banquet. There were all sorts of cooking methods represented by at least 1 dish on the table: steaming, boiling, frying, and even grilling. 2 dishes drew everyone's attention: a large plate of poached fish swimming in chili oil and a plate of golden brown, crispy fried chicken. The spicy fish dish was extremely new to the commoners, so the servers gave a short introduction when it was served. Dian Restaurant's Mr. Wang loved hunting for and trying out new dishes. As he listened to the server introducing this strange-looking dish, his eyes almost popped out of his head. On the way here to Gillen Restaurant, he had already gotten one of his servers to investigate the owner of this restaurant. It was one of House Jingyan's businesses, but it wasn't clear who the real owner was. However, his server had mentioned spotting House Ying's carriage outside just now, so Mr. Wang had a good guess as to who the owner was. Looking again at this table of novel dishes, Mr. Wang was 90% certain that it was that person. He had heard about the incident with the longevity peach buns at the Dingyuan estate. Since he had been the one to make those longevity peach buns, it wasn't weird at all that he knew about what happened then. He had always wanted to meet this third young madam of House Jingyan, that is, the current honored Lady Jeannie. If all these brand new dishes had come from that honored lady, then there was nothing unjust about this whole situation. He would willingly admit his loss. Mr. Wang reached out and grabbed a piece of poached fish with his chopsticks. Chu Lian had been afraid that the people in this era wouldn't be accustomed to eating spicy flavors, so she had prepared the chilis accordingly. After drying the chilis, they wouldn't be as spicy when used in cooking. There was only a mild spicy taste to the fish, but that was already enough to shock all the foodies present. The snow-white fish slices were smooth and tender. They practically melted in the mouth without any chewing required and carried the faint fragrance of chili. It was very appetizing. Mr. Wang's eyes widened as he savored this new sensation. He couldn't wait to try all the other dishes. As he tried each and every one, the pleasant surprise in his eyes only grew brighter. By the time he had tasted all the dishes on the table at least once, he had already lost all traces of his previous calm. Amazing! Amazing! Who could have known that such normal ingredients could bring out such an addictive taste? He was starting to believe that Gillen Restaurant could really live up to its reputation. The boasts that manager Qin had made earlier to attract the attention of the crowd weren't too exaggerated at all. He believed that the name of this old restaurant that had been hidden for more than 10 years in the Old West Market would be spread all across the capital by tomorrow. TL note: You've already seen the poached fish slices just a few chapters back. The fried chicken in the story is most likely this famous Taiwanese street food. Taiwanese fried chicken. The 13 Great Guardians is a story about Li Qiang and his 13 generals who suppressed a rebel army and chased them out of the capital during the Tang dynasty. It's based on actual historic events. There was a movie adaptation, and this Wikipedia article provides an English summary of the movie plot, with some deviations from actual history. https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/the_heroic_ones. You can read more about the history of Li Qiang through his Wikipedia article, https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/Li_Qiang. Chapter 251, Aftermath of Becoming Famous. 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. Mr. Wang suddenly recalled that some of his old friends would be coming to the capital soon. If those old fellows were to taste these dishes, they would probably become addicts on the spot. By the time Mr. Wang finally regained his senses, there were only scattered dishes and cups left on the table. He gaped in shock with his chopstick still raised in his right hand. All the dishes had been completely emptied. Some of the customers had even poured the remaining bits of sauce into their bowls and scarfed it down with rice. Damn it, I've lived for over 30 years and I've never tasted anything as delicious as this before, lamented a stocky middle-aged man wearing a short tunic. Mr. Wang slammed his chopsticks on the table in a fit of anger. Although he looked down on this group of people for wolfing down all the food without any manners at all, he realized that he would have acted the same way if he hadn't been lost in his thoughts. Actually, Mr. Wang had the same laments as that stocky man. Compared to that man's 30 years of life, the 50-year-old Mr. Wang was starting to think that all the food he had eaten before had gone to waste. After eating such amazing food, he felt that the past 50 years of his life were spent living in hell. The excitement of Gillen Restaurant's opening finally drew to a close. Now that the opening had officially ended, the Old West Market started to recover some of its usual peace and quiet. When night fell, Chu Lian returned to the Jing'an estate together with her servants. Manager Qin would take care of the remaining business at Gillen Restaurant, so she didn't have to do anything else. When she returned to the estate, she first reported everything over at Qingxi Hall before returning to her Songtao court. Senior servant Gue knew what Chu Lian's habits were like. After such a busy day, Chu Lian was definitely going to take a good rest. Thus, she had already prepared some soup for Chu Lian. After Chu Lian took a bath and ate some red bean porridge, she immediately entered her bedroom and laid down. The next day, before the sun had even risen, the narrow entrance of the Old West Market seemed to have regained some of its past glory. It wasn't just the richer common folk who had gathered there. There were even expensive-looking carriages from different noble estates lined up at the market's entrance. In order to stay close to Gillen Restaurant and be at hand for any matters, Manager Qin slept in one of the courtyards at the back of Gillen Restaurant. Now that the opening day was over, it was as if a burden had lifted from everyone's hearts. When it was time to rest at night, their hearts and minds had already completely relaxed. However, before they could get a good night's sleep, someone knocked loudly at Gillen Restaurant's entrance. Manager Qin struggled to open his eyes. He got off the bed and pushed the windows open a little. When he saw that it was still dark outside and that the moon was still hanging high in the sky, he guessed that it was around 4 in the morning. Just as he was about to return to bed and continue sleeping, there was a knock on the door of his room. Manager Qin, Manager Qin. Wake up. Come over to the entrance and take a look. Someone charged into the restaurant. What? Manager Qin was shocked wide awake thanks to the furious knocks on his door and the anxious tone of the server outside. He didn't bother trying to go back to bed and instead tugged on his outer robe and opened the door. What's going on? The server was carrying a lantern. When he noticed that Manager Chin looked like he had just gotten out of bed, he quickly explained, the entrance was filled with people. For some reason, Ah Zhong opened the door and those people just charged right in. They've been making a ruckus about reserving a table. I was going to call more of our staff to chase them off, but some of the people in the crowd look like the stewards of a noble house. The main hall's already full, so it's hard to ask them to leave now. The server's face was creased with worry. He was sweating with tension, having to deal with this situation late at night. Furthermore, one of the manservants had reported that one of the doors had been broken from the crowd squeezing in. Other people worried about whether they would get enough business. However, their Gillen restaurant had to worry about how they were going to chase away their customers. When this thought passed through the server's head, he had to resist the urge to sigh. Manager Chin had first thought that some hoodlums were trying to cause trouble for them. Who could have expected that it was actually their customers? He didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but he didn't dare to tarry. He changed into decent clothes and followed the server out to the main hall to deal with the situation. Although their owner was House Jing'an's third young madam, there were too many nobles in the capital. A single moment of carelessness could mean accidentally offending some noble family and bringing disaster upon themselves. In the dark of the night, Manager Chin and a few of his more capable subordinates got to work. It wasn't until daybreak that they finally appeased this crowd of people and got them settled. However, without even giving him the time to take a short break or even a sip of water, another crowd arrived. There were a few middle-aged men in the lead. Before they got to the entrance of Gillen restaurant, they pointed out the entrance to the people behind them with smiles on their faces. At this distance, he couldn't tell what they were saying. It wasn't even time for the restaurant to open, but Manager Chin was already sitting by the reception counter with a cup of tea. When he saw that 20 or more people were walking towards them from afar, he felt his head go numb. Those people weren't here to have a meal or reserve a table, right? Their tables had been booked all the way up till next month. As wise as Manager Chin was, he had never experienced such a situation before. In the end, he sent someone to report this matter to Chu Lian. Fortunately, he was given a solution to deal with this problem at least temporarily. Chapter 252, Getting Rich, 1. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. In the blink of an eye, the name of the old restaurant that had almost been buried in the sands of time was now known throughout the entire capital. The song that had been sung on the day of the opening, Song of Heroes, spread through all the roads and alleyways of the city. The sounds of little children singing, "The great rivers all run to the east," were heard often by the people passing by on the streets. The little courts in the back of Gillen restaurant had been practically booked full by the famous, powerful officials of the capital. Furthermore, the price to reserve a court increased day by day. Even though the customers knew very well that Gillen restaurant was doing it on purpose to earn their precious silver, there were still people who had money and were willing to spend it. On the other hand, the main hall in the front of Gillen restaurant was open to all regardless of status. The prices were also much more fair. Unfortunately, in order to have a meal there, customers had to reserve a seat at least 1 month in advance. Seeing that the demand for a table at Gillen restaurant far outstripped the supply, the majority of the capital was waiting with bated breath for Gillen restaurant to expand their business or even open up more branches. However, there was no movement at all on the part of Gillen restaurant, just like an old monk who had already settled into meditation. The number of available tables per day remained the same as well, and they refused to add even just one more to the main hall. Before the sky would even turn dark, Gillen restaurant would close its doors for the night. This frustrated many of the foodies waiting to have a taste of its novel dishes. However, even so, Gillen restaurant wasn't forgotten by the masses, rather, they became even more famous instead. The more scholarly customers who had managed to have a meal there would even lament, if you traveled to the capital and leave without having a taste of Gillen Restaurant's food, your trip was completely wasted. Those with money to burn would spend great amounts of silver to eat at Gillen Restaurant every day, thinking that they would eventually be able to wean themselves off of this addiction. However, before they could even get tired of eating the dishes currently available, Gillen Restaurant would bring out brand new dishes every month, without any repeats. The rich, the noble, and even the despotic would eat the dishes here with tears of joy, unable to escape this heavenly trap. The daily flow of customers to Gillen Restaurant brought new life to the Old West Market, making the whole street much more livelier. In just 2 months, the normal residences around Gillen Restaurant had already opened up shop fronts and began to do business on the street. The Old West Market was now bustling with noise and excitement, a far cry from its comparatively silent streets not too long ago. It had been a whole month since Gillen Restaurant had opened. Today was the day that Manager Qin would meet Chu Lian to check over the account books. Xian was even more anxious than Chu Lian was. Early in the morning, while on duty to serve by Chu Lian's side, she was so nervous that she even accidentally spilled some honey water. When Chu Lian saw this, she found it funny. "Xian, why are you so absent-minded today?" Xian thought that she might as well set down the teapot in her hands. She walked over to Chu Lian's side and took a light purple outer coat with a pattern of entwined branches from a young maidservant standing by, and then helped Chu Lian put it on. "Third young madam, aren't you the slightest bit worried? Manager Qin will be sending over the account books today." Chu Lian let Xian help her with her belt before reaching out for a teacup and taking a sip of the warm water. She nodded and said, "I know. What's there to be worried about?" After Xian finished dressing Chu Lian, she felt a sense of helplessness rising within her. "Third young madam, don't you want to know if Gillen Restaurant has made a profit or lost this first month? If the restaurant didn't manage to turn a profit, then you'll be 2,000 taels in the red. That's all the money you have at hand. Won't your heart bleed?" Right after she said that, Xian visibly became even more tense. This little brat, why was she acting as if the money used to renovate Gillen Restaurant had come from her own pockets? Chu Lian still found this funny. "There's nothing to be worried about. There's no question that we'll be able to earn it back." "Ah." Xian's mouth gaped wide open in disbelief. "Third young madam, did you know this, even before you renovated the restaurant?" "Of course I did, otherwise, why would I have gone ahead with my plans?" Xian hurriedly shook her head and kept quiet. No one else would have that sort of confidence. There was no one else who knew better than she what third young madam had sacrificed to open Gillen Restaurant. In order to get the funds for the renovation and opening, third young madam had taken all the gold accessories she had and gave them to senior servant Gue to melt. 2,000 taels wasn't a small sum. Even the most experienced merchants wouldn't have the spirit to put all of their eggs, their entire fortune, in a single basket. Xian was speechless with amazement. The only thought she had in mind was that her third young madam was incredible. Actually, Chu Lian wasn't as incredible as Xian thought she was. She simply didn't treat money as all that important. In her eyes, even if she lost the 2,000 taels she had invested, it wouldn't matter too much. She would still be House Jingyan's third young madam and be able to eat good food all day. Furthermore, she wasn't all that bad at business in the first place, at least not to the point that she would lose all her capital. If Xian were to find out that the master she greatly admired had thoughts like that, she would definitely roll her eyes. Chapter 253, Getting Rich, 2. This chapter has been stolen from LoveLore novels. Please read from the original source. In the afternoon, Manager Qin came to the estate dressed in a new purplish-blue robe. Chu Lian met him in the parlor of Songtao Court. Perhaps due to a whole month of good business, as well as Gillen Restaurant's good food, the young Manager Qin seemed to have become fatter. His originally slim body had turned into a potbelly, giving the maidservants the urge to sweat. "Third young madam, this is Gillen Restaurant's account book for the past month." Manager Chin bowed respectfully towards Chu Lien before offering up the account book with 2 hands. Chu Lien flipped through 1 or 2 pages of the book before setting it aside. "Manager Chin, give me a short summary of the accounts. I'll keep this account book and go through it in detail over the next few days." Manager Chin couldn't wait for Chu Lien to ask him about the accounts. He had learned how to manage shops by following his father around since he was young. Later on, as the years passed, he was able to manage businesses by himself. Perhaps due to the influence of his younger years, he was able to turn a normal store into a profitable business at the tender age of 15. He was already in his 20s now, but this Gillen restaurant was one of the most successful businesses he had ever managed. Thus, he couldn't wait to show off his achievements to Chu Lien. When Xian heard the number that Manager Chin reported, she froze on the spot from shock. 3,580 taels. That was after subtracting the running expenses for Gillen Restaurant. That is to say, Gillen Restaurant had turned a profit of 3,580 taels alone this month. Heavens! Taking away the 2,000 taels of initial capital that Chu Lien had invested in Gillen Restaurant at the start, that was still 1,800 taels of pure profit. What kind of concept was that? Xian's mind immediately turned blank. Chu Lien had already expected a profit from Gillen Restaurant, so she wasn't as shocked as Xian was. However, even so, that amount had completely exceeded her expectations for the first month. She had really underestimated the spending power of the people in the capital. After asking Manager Chin for a few more details, it was only an hour later that senior servant Gue escorted Manager Chin out. Chu Lien opened up the wooden box of money that Manager Chin had left behind and took out 2 bills to pass to Xian. "Keep these for Songtao Court's daily expenses. Mother's birthday is coming, so we can use that chance to give out some rewards for all the people in our courtyard. You can decide what to do with the rest of the money by yourself." Xian held the 200 tael bank notes in her hands and spoke with disbelief in her tone. "Third young madam, all this is from Gillen Restaurant's profit?" Chu Lien glared at her speechlessly. "Of course. Do you want to count through all the notes in this box and see if it's really 1,000 taels? Xian quickly shook her head. No, this servant doesn't have to count it. This servant trusts that there's 1,000 taels in there. Third young madam, you're amazing. This servant just can't really believe it. Back in the Ing estate, it would have taken us quite a few years to save up 100 taels. Chu Lien blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected this girl to think back to the past. Alright, don't think about those things now. I'm not the 6th Miss of Housing anymore. I'm now House Jingan's 3rd young madam and an honored lady personally named by the emperor. Xian rubbed away the tears that had leaked out unconsciously from her eyes. That's right. Young madam's days are much better now. If only 3rd young master could be by young madam's side, then all would be well. Xian's words made Chu Lien's face stiffen. Her days had been too carefree, she had almost forgotten that she had a husband who had gone off to the northern border. She wondered how that crazy, unfortunate husband of hers was doing. She hadn't gotten any letters from him for a month. Maybe the blank letters she had sent him had upset him and made him even more unhinged. Chu Lien shook her head. What was she doing thinking about He Sanlang? It was more important to pass her days in peace. She remembered that the great Dr. Miao was supposed to appear in the capital around this time. Chu Lien blinked and the corners of her lips lifted up in excitement. With her here, she wasn't going to let that Xiao Bojian get to great Dr. Miao first. Sometimes, you really can't speak of the devil. Not even an hour had passed since she had thought about how He Sanlang hadn't sent any letters back for a while, when senior servant Luke personally came over to Songtao Court with some maidservants in tow. Chu Lian stood up to welcome her. Senior servant Lu was wearing an azure cloak lined with down. Her hair was pressed flat to her face thanks to the outside winds, and it looked like she had rushed all the way here. Momo, please come in and sit. Have a cup of hot tea. Chu Lian quickly ordered Fuyan to serve some tea. It was already October and the weather was turning cold. Winters in the capital were always bitterly cold and dry. Senior servant Lu was clearly in high spirits as she took out a thick letter from her sleeve without waiting for the tea. She passed the letter to Chu Lian and said, "Third young madam, third young master personally wrote this for you. Look, it's such a thick letter, too." Chu Lian's lips parted in surprise as she took the parcel. Husband sent letters back. It was only then that senior servant Lu took a seat and sighed. If it isn't so. There was another letter for the matriarch as well. These were just sent here by a soldier from the post house. He said that there was a huge snowstorm near the northern border and the highways between the cities were blocked. We were supposed to get this letter about half a month ago, but it was delayed thanks to the snowstorm. I heard the northern border is supposed to be many times colder than the capital. Third young master has never been to the northern border before. I wonder if he'll be able to get used to the weather there. As senior servant Lu spoke, her eyes started to redden and the tears gathered in her eyes fell. Amongst the three young masters in House Jing'an, senior servant Lu cared the most for He Changdi. Back then, after Countess Jing'an had given birth to He Changdi, her health had taken a turn for the worse and He Sanlang had been practically raised by his grandmother. Senior servant Lu had taken care of He Sanlang alongside his nursemaid. Chu Lian had gotten lost in her thoughts after hearing senior servant Lu's words. The weather at the northern border had already turned cold, and it was already snowing in the nearby cities. So early. There was no longer any trace of the excitement and joy she had had earlier. Instead, her brows drew together in tension. This was the first time senior servant Lu had seen such an expression on third young madam. She thought that her words had caused third young madams to worry, so she quickly wiped away her tears and forced herself into using a happier tone. It's this old servant's fault. Third young madam, please don't worry. Although third young master looks a little skinny due to his height, he has been practicing martial arts alongside the count and his brothers ever since he was a child, and he's very skilled. The weather at the northern border must be nothing to him. Furthermore, all we've heard is some hearsay from others, so it might not be true. See, third young master sent out his letters after all. Third young madam, why don't you open it up and see what third young master has written? You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.